Mr. Speaker, I move that this House, notwithstanding the suggestions in the Economic Strategy Review on the future Singapore economy, believes A, in a more equal and inclusive economy with opportunities for entrepreneurs to experiment, households and businesses to succeed, workers to thrive, and ideas and innovation to flourish. And in B, in an economic engine driven by dynamic local companies, healthy domestic demand, and Singaporean capital venturing abroad. Why this motion? Why now? Singaporeans face a uniquely challenging set of circumstances. The major model of Singaporeans getting on the economic ladder has been jobs. Without a job, you're not able to afford renting a place or buying a HDB flat. Without your own place, it is difficult to think about having children. And for these children, few dream of being entrepreneurs, with 9 in 10 working here, becoming someone's employee. For almost all of us, the jobs ladder is the main route up, with not many Singaporeans becoming entrepreneurs. The reasons given are variously these: that the market is small and the cost of business daunting, that they lack social safety nets for risk-taking, that not enough true growth capital exists for all the private wealth attracted here, that the biggest competitor to Singaporean startups and SMEs are the Singaporean GLCs. These we have the power to influence. Property has been a lottery ticket to many Singaporeans, but with asset prices as high as they are, it is highly questionable if a new generation can follow this model without parental support, given initial conditions of wages, lagging asset prices, and declining employment prospects. The persistence of property as a wealth vehicle breeds a rentier mindset. One generation's ideology hardens into the next generation's psychology. And as intergenerational transfers come to dominate socioeconomic status, they threaten to entrench inequity. Let me recap why our job structure is threatened, though I suspect this is not news to many. Our job structure rests on being the best place in the region for foreign companies to base themselves. We host many large companies, but build few of them. Singapore has 3 companies in the Fortune Global 500. All 3 are commodity traders. 2 were founded here, 2 were founded elsewhere and moved here. Korea has 13, Taiwan has 6. Theirs make semiconductors and ships. Theirs were built by their own people. Ours came here and can as easily go. At the high value end, tariffs are pulling production home and to friendly countries, reducing the supply of marginal new investment available to Singapore. And less of what moves can be won on tax competition. For an increasing number of R&D and manufacturing jobs, speed of iteration, equipping, and supply are decisive factors. At the cost-sensitive end, high business costs and slow manpower approvals accelerate offshoring to regional centers based in countries like Malaysia and Vietnam. The examples are not unfamiliar to this House. H&M moved its Southeast Asia regional HQ from Singapore to KL. Tiger Beer has been brewed here since 1932. By the end of next year, it will not be. Heineken is winding down brewing at Tuas and moving production to Malaysia and Vietnam, and about 130 jobs go with it. For our younger generation, they face the change playbook. The high-paying entry-level tech jobs that many aspired to have largely dried up. Many entry-level roles have been offshored due to the high cost of business. And capable AI agents and models are set to reduce the need for entry-level hiring. But whatever the cause, it is undeniably hard for a young Singaporean to find a job today. What follows is adaptation, entrepreneurship by necessity rather than by choice, second and third jobs, structural underemployment. In a high-cost economy, the work most likely to stay is work that cannot be done more cheaply somewhere else. The standard answer for advanced economies has been R&D, build what others cannot easily copy, so that firms come here in spite of our costs. But after decades and tens of billions, not one local R&D champion has emerged worth more than $1 billion. Of course, we should continue to invest, but the upshot is that our R&D complex is sadly not ready to be our growth engine. And as individual Chinese provinces and groups thereof become increasingly fiercely competitive ecosystems, every economy will need to reckon with the necessary scale, energy availability, and the cost required to compete. Alone, it is difficult. That is why I believe we must have greater industrial coordination between Southeast Asian countries and engage in transnational industrial policy, as I elaborated in both my maiden speech last September and my adjournment motion this July. These are structural challenges to the industrial underpinning of jobs. I acknowledge the government continues to try to do its best under these circumstances. Investment into Singapore is holding up. EDB committed $14.2 billion of fixed asset investment last year, up from 13.5 the year before and 12.7 the year before that. So 3 years rising. But for it, we get the opposite trend in jobs. In 2023, 20,000 jobs. In 2024, 18,700 jobs. And last year, 15,700 jobs. The value added expected went from $26.7 billion to $23.5 billion to 18. So even on official statistics, the engine of investment to jobs is faltering. Faced with such a panoply of problems, what can and should we hope for? First, we need an updated growth model that cares not only about the headline GDP growth figure, but the structure of growth. If we truly believe this is a changed world, then our policies must change with it. The structure of growth matters, and growth and distribution are not two things to be done in sequence. It's acceptable as an exigency to grow first and then redistribute by vouchers and rebates. But over the medium and long term, we should be building an economy where a fair distribution is produced by the growth itself, rather than repaired afterwards out of the proceeds. Pre-distribution or redistribution. And that's why we need an economic engine driven by dynamic local companies, healthy domestic demand, and Singaporean capital venturing abroad. Only when Singaporeans thrive and believe the ladders of opportunity are fair to all can this country be open. Second, we need honest measurement and prioritization of what matters from growth. Let me offer 3 North Stars for the distributional aspect of growth. A, the indigenous share of national income, which captures the contribution to national income of Singaporeans as workers, owners, and entrepreneurs. Its internationally comparable cousin is the labor share. How much of what stays in Singapore goes to the people who work here? Ours, at about 40%, lacks most advanced economies. We should resurrect the indigenous income series and measure the whole of what Singaporeans contribute. B, real income growth that keeps pace with productivity, not lag it. Overall, labor productivity has grown by 2.5% per year from 2016 to 2024. But over the same year, real mean income only grew at 1.3% per year. Singaporeans have always been model workers. From 2016 to 2024, according to the ILO, Singapore's output per worker grew 2.3% per year, outstripping major economies such as the US at 1.6%, Israel at 1.6%, Hong Kong at 1.3%, Korea at 1.3%, and Switzerland at 1.1%. We need to repair this lag. Singaporean workers have kept their end of the bargain. Their compensation has not kept up with it. C, whether Singaporeans can still afford the city they built. Not how much we produce, but how much variety ordinary Singaporeans on an ordinary wage can enjoy. Diversity of services available, how much they can afford, and the leisure they can afford to take. The independent kitchen, the second-hand bookstore. We cannot in one breath lose our heritage businesses and our art spaces, and the next tell Singaporeans that the city is thriving. Cities compete on the variety of things there are to consume, not only on what they produce, and higher amenity cities grow faster. So we should measure it, how varied the choices are, and how many choices an ordinary wage can afford. These 3 North Stars point us towards a more equal and inclusive economy with opportunities for entrepreneurs to experiment, households and businesses to succeed, workers to thrive, and ideas and innovation to flourish. Mr. Speaker, the various MPs of the Workers' Party will touch on 8 questions to answer the challenges I've laid out. First, I will discuss innovation under constraint. How do we foster a dynamic enterprise and innovation system that maximizes value regardless of the high business costs and physical constraints? Second, my colleague Jamus Lim will discuss dynamic local firms. How can we create a business climate in which dynamic local firms emerge as drivers of innovation and become future cornerstones of the economy? Third, my colleague Louis Chua will discuss land and the roof over the household. How do we ensure that attractive, affordable housing is available for every Singaporean household? Fourth, my colleague Andre Loh will discuss the start of a working life and ask how we ensure our tertiary students and young workers find meaningful opportunities and good jobs in a challenging economy. Fifth, my colleague Gerald Giam will will discuss pathways to a middle-class livelihood. Taking tradespersons as his exemplar, he will ask how we create accessible pathways for them to earn a middle-class livelihood. 6. My colleague Fadli Fawzi will discuss replacement and re-entry and ask whether our system of continuing education could actually works, the journey, the destination, and the proof. We close the WP contributions with our two most expansive views of the economic model. 7th, my colleague Ting Ru will discuss the lesser measured parts of the economy in the domestically oriented sectors and ask what parts of this economy our national statistics fail to capture. And 8th, my colleague Eileen Chong will discuss venturing abroad. How do we empower Singaporeans to seize opportunities in the region and beyond? Mr. Speaker, beyond these questions, there really is one question. What does it mean to take a changed world seriously? If we mean to rebuild the ladder of opportunity in this generation, the answers to these problems must be the centerpiece of our evolved economic model. In these speeches, my colleague will lay out in 8 steps structural solutions to structural problems. Today, the problem I will tackle is enterprise and innovation under constraint. For 2 generations, we have been good at bringing other people's companies here. We have been slow to put the same land that we own behind our people building their own. Why do we take a high land price as a law like gravity? Universal land pricing is a coherent and convenient accounting ideology. But in the last accounting, the people of Singapore need to decide if this ideology still serves them. Families already know this. Tuition is expensive, and no tutor can promise a good job 20 years out. We pay anyway. Investments require outlays. We do not ask a child for an immediate payoff. So the proposition, Singapore should stop treating market land value as a natural price for every socially productive use of land. And the test, a university-centered special zone where state land is priced at development cost rather than market scarcity value. What is our offer to the young? We should remake our system, the system with the young, as the first consideration rather than the last adjustment. Today, we tweak a discount on a co-living room, a grant, a priority ban in a ballot, adjustments at the edge of a system designed around somewhere else in a different decade. Treating the young as a first-order principle means the opposite. We design for the 20-something-year-old foremost. This is a supply-side problem of policy. Before we can remake society to be young, we must remake society for the young. The bargain has 4 parts. A place to live, near where the work and the research happen, at a price a starting salary can carry. In service of something the country needs, more local enterprise and R&D, with the upside staying with the risk takers and a say in the rules. Or we should create a special zone surrounding NTU where the state land is charged as cost recovery rather than market scarcity value and takes its returns in the companies that grow there rather than in rent. This experiment will span land rates for both residential and commercial space, spanning co-living, local enterprise, and R&D. It must be centered around an existing core, a university, because one cannot rustle up a cluster from nothing. But one can take one that exists and play to its strengths. It will be zoned for organic messiness, a district that is pro-worker and pro-business, built around the needs of young people and young companies. And if this experiment is reversible, if it does not work, we can simply revert to the master plan. But surely today's Singaporeans should have as much say over scarce land as the master planners of decades ago. So let me take the argument in this order. Land, our tertiary institutions, and then governments and money. First, land. 30 years, tens of billions in R&D, and more again on fostering entrepreneurship. Both R&D and the ladder of growing local giants have underperformed. We are world-class at marshalling inputs, but commercial outcomes in terms of Singaporean-grown companies have not appeared at the rate the spending implies. On talent, we want to attract the very best to work alongside a strong local core. On capital, we disagree about design, but perhaps not ideology. But there is a serious methodological point. The state runs on taxpayers' money. Prudence is its duty. Innovation requires the opposite, calibrated risk-taking, which is why risk capital belongs in a policy investment bank rather than inside government, as the Prime Minister proposes. A prudence-first posture is difficult to unlearn. Where we do have an ideological disagreement is the price of land. My colleague, Mr. Louis Chua, will also speak about this later. The ESR organizes itself around inputs to production: capital, labor, productivity. But land, an input distinct from capital, is discussed as revenue and not as a cost, a constraint to live within and not as a lever to change. And it's not a small cost. In December 2022, the government put the development cost of that year's 13,506 completed flats at 396,000 each, 234,000 of land against 154,000 of construction. Land was 59% of the cost of a flat. But of course, we can test and change this cost. We have been here before. The Center for Livable Cities, the government's own urban research arm, records what happened when One North was planned. Quote, "The idea of providing residential users in the form of affordable housing was put forth. However, it was difficult for HDB to change its public housing policies for a single project like One North. Therefore, the JTC approached the private sector." End quote. National policy then could not bend for One North, but it should have. What we need for R&D and entrepreneurship matters more than dogmatic inflexibility. A high price homogenizes. It prices out the independent kitchen and the lab with no revenue yet, and leaves whatever can pay the rent, chains and franchises. It also programs space. A market scarcity rate selects for what can be proven in advance, and nothing new can be proven in advance. By definition, the novel has no track record. Thus, the experimental messiness of life is competed out. A zone of lower commercial pressure is a zone for messiness, a zone where land is cheap enough for the young to make their own places and their own future organically, the first variable and not an accommodation. If land pricing is an unnecessary drag on the young, on enterprise, or an R&D cluster, how do we test it? There is a formidable constraint. Singaporeans need land prices low to start something, to live somewhere, and we need them high, because many of our savings sit in HDB flats, and the state leans on land revenue. To have both high land pricing and low land pricing simultaneously, we must do away with the constraint of universal land pricing. There are at least three ways to vary a price. First, across time, the island-wide price itself. Second, across a policy-targeted group, as the BTO does for young parents. Third, across a geographic boundary, fence one area and change the pricing function inside in service of agglomeration and enterprise. People and firms pack close enough to make each other more productive. I believe that the third is the least disruptive theory of change, if one believes that our land pricing assumptions need to be tested. And the question becomes where to test such a zone, for the young, for the R&D economy, and for an entrepreneurial spirit. It belongs around our tertiary institutions. And looking at the map, I believe NTU is the obvious candidate. Now, why NTU? The research cluster is already there. A large number of labs are sited on campus. And unlike NUS, whose Kent Ridge and One North districts have little room left, NTU can still expand. What is planned for Bahar and Cleantech Park? 116 hectares adjoining NTU. It is another industrial park. The same answer the party opposite has given again and again. If we are to clear scarce greenery, the use case must be distinctive enough to be worth the sacrifice. I believe ours is, and another industrial park is not. That is something priceless and irreversible, traded for something cookie cutter. Take Punggol Digital District, which is 50 hectares, JTC developed and anchored on SIT's campus. It proves that the government will build a district around a university, but it's more of the same we have done, a business park with a campus in it on market terms. If one accepts the first principle case for a special zone, then two empirical facts must be dealt with. First, the Jurong Region Line is being dug into NTU, with campus stations arriving at the end of the decade. Tengah's flats are rising beside it. Kept as separate plans, they make one more park that people commute into. The Jurong Innovation District, 620 hectares, holds in Bahar the next greenfield precinct, already zoned with the EIA underway. The better bargain is a district for living, working, and playing, and for enterprise. And this new district around NTU would be our last chance to run this sort of experiment. Whatever we settle on this parcel becomes how we price the ground beside every campus after it. Second, the Johor Zone Agreement was signed in January 2025. It is an experiment we must try to make succeed. But for all our hopes on foreign economic policy, it sits in another country and carries the risk that comes with that. We can and should run these experiments for ourselves, by ourselves, if we can, and we can. If we want to reorient our culture towards a spirit of independent living, towards the spirit of risk-taking, towards the spirit of collaboration, then we must provide the conditions for this spirit to flourish. We should not be distracted by procedural arguments that Bahar and Jurong are already zoned in a master plan. The experiment can be run as things stand. The question is whether we will. So, NTU as the center of a live, work, build district, distinguished by charging land for housing at cost recovery. By cost, I mean cost in the ordinary sense, with all scarcity value excluded. The actual cost of constructing, financing, servicing, maintaining, and renewing the buildings, not the hypothetical market value of the ground beneath them. What would that come to? We have a few indications. At NTU this academic year, a non-air-conditioned double costs about $412 a month, and an air-conditioned single about $657. At NUS, a double in hall runs about $494. Under the co-living scheme announced late July this year under the SG Youth Plan, a room starts at $1,800 a month at 1925 quarters, $1,950 at Koliwu, Boon Lay, and $2,000 at Koliwu, Lutheran. Before utilities and deposits, roughly 30% below the usual rate, with operators absorbing the difference. The one at Boon Lay is about 4 kilometers from NTU and costs roughly 5 times what the university charges its own students. Is it affordable? I do not think it is. The median fresh graduate from our 6 autonomous universities earned $4,500 a month last year. After CPF, about $3,600 in hand. The Boon Lay rate plus its fixed utility charge takes about 60% of it after the discount. This is not treating our young as a first-order consideration. Our young want space of their own and financial autonomy as a precondition for life, not as a byproduct of marriage. And 30% below market is measured against the scarcity market. Before the discount, the same room took more than 3/4 of a graduate's take-home pay. Affordability must be benchmarked against what a young Singaporean actually has to spend rather than market rate discounts. So what can we offer with a different basis? On a cost recovery basis, a room comes to well under half the going rate, closer to a third. Take one calculation that owes nothing to a university subsidy. A 500 square foot unit at $200 a square foot, above the construction cost implied by the government's own 2022 figures. So it's a conservative assumption and not a hopeful one. If you put 3 people in it, amortized over 10 years at 5%, it comes out to about $1,061 a month, or $202.12 a square foot. Roughly $380 a head with a sinking fund in. Stretch the amortization to 20 years and it's $1.32 a square foot. Other calculations land in the same place. The university's own rate, annualized over 12 months rather than 35 weeks a term actually runs, comes out to about $478 to $549 a room. The universities are already housing people at close to cost. So we can arrive at a figure between $350 and $550 a month a room. I know the reply this will draw. All state land forms part of the reserves. Land must be sold at fair market value, otherwise the reserves are depleted. So let us look at practice and not just theory. Start with an instrument we have already written. The Land Betterment Charge, Concessionary Relief Order 2022, waives the betterment charge on state-leased university land put to education and institutional use, and defines university as the National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University. So concessions already exist for the university. Nor is that the only place the state prices by decision. Land for a place of worship or a civic and community institution is already valued at half of full land value. On the Land Betterment Charge table effective this March, this is about 1/10 of what residential land in the same sector is assessed at. That rate line is not only for rates of worship, places of worship. Educational and institutional use sits in the same group and is charged at 3 rates across the whole island, while every residential and commercial rate moves across 118 sectors. For one class of use, the state already sets a price by decision rather than location. And in 2023, the government moved places of worship from competitive tender to fixed price ballot, precisely because bidding had driven prices to levels that distracted religious bodies into fundraising. Prices fell. Apparently, nobody raided the reserves. What can we surmise? For the party opposite, fair market value is already a function of the interest granted. It is not a single number attached to a plot. Once you change the use class, the fair market value changes with it lawfully, with the chief valuer still doing the valuing. The government identified a market mechanism, was pricing a use out of its own purpose, replaced it with an administered price, got a lower number, and the chief valuer still called it fair market value. So let's use the rules as they are. Let's create a use category for non-tradable, restricted tenure, mixed housing and enterprise land, and let the chief valuer value that restricted interest. A clear valuation to build productive capacity for the next generation is not a raid on the reserves. It is the outlay side of an investment. It is what every family who pays for tuition for better economic prospects for their kids already knows. It is long-term economic foresight over short-term economic thinking. How would the zone work if demand exceeds supply? We could ballot. Once in, the rent stays low once you are part of the zone, studying, working, building, or serving it. Leaving is built in. A firm gets a fixed term and an option to renew, then graduates out upon success. And a person who loses a job and startup dies gets a years of grace before the rent resets. And if the housing is rented, never sold, it doesn't become an asset to be traded. Mr. Speaker, the price of land matters greatly, but it's not sufficient on its own. We must get the other conditions right too. On governance, an innovation district is a place where things are tried, and most of them fail. That requires us to tolerate some untidiness. Most of what I'm asking requires no new legislation. JTC lets its land on contracts it writes itself, rent formulas, renewal test quotas, carve-outs, occupancy, covenants. These are lease terms and not statutes with already existing latitude. We should lift URA's planning circular, capping non-academic use of a campus at 5% of floor area, or 30,000 square meters. We can hasten visa decisions for deep tech researchers and for the people the enterprises need, and aim to have every major decision made in such a zone made within 2 weeks. We should aim to devolve operational decisions to the zone's own board. Small and nimble, with the anchor university on it, able to make bundled decisions on space, pilots, housing allocation, visas, and procurements. And the board should be responsive to the people living in the zone, who should have a say in how it is run. On money, we should give this zone the ability to back its founders and enterprises. Lower rent is part of the draw. The bigger draw should be growth capital, the zone taking a stake in the enterprises that grow inside it. Singapore and China established Suzhou Industrial Park in 1994. The zone grew its own investment arm, Ariza Holdings, state-owned, controlled by the park's administration committee, incorporated in 2001, and with about 14 billion under management today. So while we are not involved in Ariza, a zone-based financing body is not unknown to us. Many financial innovations have come from zones. China's new third board, its national over-the-counter equity market for unlisted small companies, began in 2006 as the Zhongguancun Science Park share transfer pilot and went nationwide in 2013. So we should capitalize a zone authority that can invest while providing optimal conditions for its startups and enterprises to succeed, taking a capped equity or revenue stake, and allow it to appropriate a portion of the funds it generates to further develop the zone. A zone of lower immediate commercial pressure for these enterprises is a place where experimentation and diversity can flourish. Speaker, the zone is one bounded, reversible way to try on available land at a price that takes nothing from the reserves, with land prices outside the zone exactly the way they were, a way to make more Singaporeans involved in enterprise and R&D, and not only employees. So the ask is threefold. A zone around NTU, a new use category for restricted tenure, non-tradable, mixed housing and enterprise land, valued as the restricted interest it is, and a zone authority that runs its own operations and takes stakes in the enterprises it grows. It is a controlled experiment in whether Singapore's land pricing regime is suppressing agglomeration, entrepreneurship, and indigenous capital formation. If there is a Singaporean secret sauce that adheres beyond the cost pressures of land and wages, then the zone here, alongside the one in Johor, will tell us. It is a test we should run for our younger generation. We have spent 30 years making this country a good place for other people's companies to succeed. I am asking that we spend the next 30 making it a place where ours can. Not just a better deal for the young, a country which is built categorically for the young. Speaker, in closing, there has been much talk that the world is changing and it's not changing back. We can all feel it. So here's a test of whether we are serious. We must reform significant parts of our present economic structure to deal with a changed world, to pursue growth that distributes more fairly, and to measure what makes that growth worth having, a fair share of national income, real income growth in line with productivity, and a widening range of what an ordinary wage can afford. Many of these changes must come at the national level. But some assumptions, long in the tooth, that must be tested. Universal market land pricing is one, and the policy laboratory at real scale is how we test it. The zone is one part. In this motion, each of my honourable friends will bring another, structural solutions to structural problems. Singaporeans deserve serious answers, and serious answers are what the Workers' Party will provide. That's why we have moved this motion to create an economy of the future that works for all. Sir, I beg to move.
Mr. Speaker, I second the motion in the name of my honourable friend, Kenneth Tiong. I cannot agree more that we need both dynamic local companies and opportunities for businesses to succeed, which is why my contribution to this debate will focus on how we can wean ourselves away from a top-down, foreign investment-reliant, multinational corporation or MNC-centric economic model, and instead build a bottom-up, domestic capital-led, small and medium enterprise, or SME, focus one. I will also weave in constructive critique on the recently released Economic Strategy Review, or ESR. To start, it's useful to sketch out what our traditional growth model has been. Essentially, the strategy was to accumulate more of what economists call factors of production, to ride on increases in the labor force due to demographic change, while simultaneously building up complementary capital, both manufactured in the form of machines, factories, equipment, as well as human, through education. For the former, we marshaled foreign savings, with heavy foreign direct investment from MNCs in the early years, and, since the turn of the century, inward portfolio investment from global funds and family offices. We supplemented this with forced domestic saving from households in the form of CPF and from the state by maintaining large fiscal surpluses. For the latter, we cranked up educational attainment by rapidly educating our school-aged children, then starting in the 1990s by increasingly absorbing skilled workers from abroad. We coupled this build-up of factors with fundamentals. Exploiting our geographical location, we fostered an economy open to trade in goods, services, and finance. We also placed emphasis on quality institutions, an attractive, low-tax climate, respect for property rights, and rule of law, and high-functioning civil service. We fired on all these cylinders, which brought us famously from a per capita income of around $1,600 at independence, $1,600 Singapore dollars at independence, to more than 121,000 today, a massive increase by any stretch of the imagination. Now, notwithstanding how we were already ahead in the 1960s, at least relative to the rest of the developing world, our growth story is undeniably impressive. Now, this model is not unique to us. It was successfully deployed by Japan in its early industrialization. And the approach, with some idiosyncratic variations, was how the other East Asian dragon economies of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore and South Korea became wealthy. And starting in the 1980s, China has adapted the self-same model. As successful as this traditional model was, it had embedded within it several pathologies. It made us obsessed, somewhat, with courting foreign capital and fearful of right-minded pro-worker policies that would reduce our attractiveness as regional headquarters. Our educational system churned out a formidable number of excellent operators, but far fewer risk-taking entrepreneurs. And in the drive to economize on scarce land, our government's leasehold model has fostered a rent-seeking mindset in real estate, rather than treating land as just another normal input to production. Perhaps the most damning drawback is a known design flaw. In the relentless pursuit of accumulating inputs to production, we have lagged in productivity growth. Now, to be fair, this was also the case with the other dragon economies. Yet even among them, Singapore has fared the worst. Just as important, these other economies, once they entrenched their high income status, began to evolve their model toward a more internally driven, self-sustaining, productivity-led one. We have yet to do so decisively. Some may argue that we should make no excuses for growth. I believe that this is incomplete at best and misguided at worst. After all, we already know how to drive root growth. Crank up capital expenditure to the detriment of labor, income, and productivity. Indeed, This has been the consistent criticism of Singapore's growth model during its rapid growth phase from the 1960s through to the 1990s, and was arguably the impetus for the menagerie of productivity campaigns and bodies that, alas, has not overturned our nation's productivity woes. And while it's tempting for us to look at bolstering growth from tried and tested tools, such as building up yet more of our already intensive capital stock, we must resist, because it is clear that disproportionately prioritizing resource allocation into hard infrastructure investment, especially in real estate, is running up against diminishing returns. So, what would such a new model look like? For starters, we must evolve away from our traditional reliance on foreign MSCs as a driver of our growth and pivot toward SMEs as our homegrown economic engine. While the ESR speaks about both, it betrays somewhat an implicit bias toward the former. We need a conscious shift from not too much fixation with tax competition, an undervalued exchange rate, and the wooing of footloose multinationals. We must instead promote bottom-up formation and growth of our indigenous companies and unleash the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit of our local workforce. This means weaning our companies off a race-to-the-bottom focus on cost-cutting as the only means to be competitive. Revenue and wages should instead hinge on productivity gains, not a relentless search for cheaper inputs. Margins can and should be driven by elevating value add and quality. What we want is a made in Singapore to be synonymous with better, not just faster or cheaper, which is best left to economies lower down the income ladder. Now, to be clear, this is not simply an appeal for faster growth, not just for growth's sake. It is of existential importance, especially in the age of artificial intelligence. Research shows that worldwide, small firms drive disruptive innovation, and startups are the bulwark of sustainable growth through this process of creative destruction. Yet, while SMEs account for 99 out of 100 registered enterprises here and provide jobs for 7 out of 10 Singaporean workers, they currently only contribute to half of the economy's value added. If our SMEs are stifled because business or funding opportunities are crowded out by the bigger players, they will never discover our own homegrown, globally competitive unicorns. Or if they simply choose to coast along without feeling empowered to challenge large incumbent firms, we will never build a vibrant body of SMEs that form the backbone of our economy, like Germany's Mittelstand or Japan's Taiheiyo industrial belt. To enable this transformation, we need a domestic body of medium-sized enterprises capable of growing to become the next wave of national corporate champions and driving a 21st century innovation-led economy. We need Singaporeans to start Singaporean companies and for these companies to grow and succeed domestically and on the world stage. Now, Singapore is no stranger to support for SMEs. The government will undoubtedly point to a veritable grab bag of schemes, such as the Productivity Solutions Grant, Skills Future, Enterprise Credit, Enterprise Development Grant, Market Readiness Assistance, Enterprise Workforce Transformation Package. I could go on. Now, the question isn't whether these are useful. They are. The issue is whether these catalytic grants will spur SME activity sufficiently to allow them to systematically advance to the next stage of growth, or whether there are other structural impediments that inhibit them from transforming themselves from small local firms to medium-sized, globally or competitive ones. Businesses themselves report several key constraints to growth. Most notably, SMEs struggle with low levels of productivity, something that the government itself has explicitly acknowledged. Many report an inability to attract and retain the sort of talent that will allow them to elevate their efficiency and output. Now, to be fair, our SMEs have to confront business costs among the highest in the world. And to compound the challenge, SMEs must secure financing for investment, which is especially scarce once they exit the startup stage. Our SMEs must stand ready to be the source of development innovation, the D in R&D. I've shared with this House previously about how, at less than 2% of GDP, our nation's R&D remains squarely below the global average and significantly behind that of leading innovation nations. But I also explained that this was because of anemic R&D spending by the private sector, not the government. Alas, among SMEs, this is even worse. The overwhelming majority of business R&D expenditure, or BERD, is likely to be from large enterprises. The ESR talks about R&D, but it does not underscore the importance of this pivot. I note that the Prime Minister's office announced last year a 37 billion commitment to research, innovation, and enterprise funding over the next 5 years. This will bring our public expenditure to around 1%, which will be among the global leaders. But we need to accelerate private R&D, not just with more public funding, but with complementary funding from our private capital markets as well. To be fair, tax incentives for corporations to undertake R&D are already very generous, with up to 400% deduction for the first 400,000 of qualifying expenditures every assessment year, supplemented more recently by up to 100% in refundable investment credits. SMEs have been major beneficiaries, making up 85% of R&D claims. But improving productivity is not about innovation alone. Research has shown that one important impediment to improving the efficiency of smaller firms is the quality of management. There may therefore be a case to expand the scope of qualifying R&D activities for the purposes of tax deductions for this group. This is especially for activities aimed at product commercialization, enhanced internal business operation, or overseas expansion. What is also missing is a coherent innovation pathway for all SMEs, not just those oriented towards sexy, cutting-edge fields. Founders of old economy startups may not necessarily possess the technological sophistication to navigate the Go Business Directory or the awareness to seek out business advisors in Enterprise SG. They may not be able to string together the myriad packages available or even put together credible applications. What is needed is a push rather than pull strategy, where new business registrants are automatically and routinely offered information on how they can access support from the government to roll out business development innovations over the course of their initial years. Even better, startups can match with seconded experts that grow the R&D capabilities in-house, akin to A-Star's T-Up program. There remains additional room for the state to act as well, through its indirect influence on GLCs. Despite being half of our economy's value added, R&D spending by domestic enterprises accounts for only 1 out of every $5. Our GLCs can lead the way by dedicating more of their retained earnings toward expenditures in applied research and development, subject to a reasonable return on investment period. Over the medium run, they can look more toward elevating their spending to more closely match those of other MNCs. Finally, we can also support SME productivity indirectly by tackling our sky-high business costs. Speaking to SMEs, the subject of crushing manpower and rent inevitably emerges. Yet scaling up and relocating is not always an option, and hence we need to look for alternatives. One simple strategy is to cap the maximum quantum that rents may increase every year to the historical increase of about 3% annually. This is a limit on the rate, not the level. Market rents will still prevail in the long run. Still, doing so will give time for businesses to adjust to jumps in their fixed costs. Such restrictions have been employed by many jurisdictions worldwide, and even if we limit it to government and agency landlords, such as HDB or JTC, it will be a major step forward. It may also be time to revisit the dependency ratio ceiling, or DRC, for certain sectors, like F&B, where Singaporeans continue to shun open positions that are advertised even at attractive wages. Sir, at the heart of the challenge of raising up our local SMEs is the difficulty of attracting and retaining talented workers. Singaporeans often view small firm jobs as small-time, second-tier operations compared to a more lucrative, prestigious MNC career. The ESR report, while rightly emphasizing the importance of good jobs, remains largely silent on the gap between SME and MNC positions and how they may be bridged. Bridging this gap must recognize that smaller firms often struggle to round up sufficient financing for investment compared to larger ones. Relieving internal and external access to finance for the purposes of easing cash flow that will unlock hiring is first order if we wish to improve the viability of our young, dynamic companies. There are already schemes that support small enterprise business development. For example, the Enterprise Development Grant, or EDG, is aimed at projects, and the Productivity Solutions Grant, or PSG, is aimed at IT equipment. And they ostensibly relieve financial constraints. The EDG even explicitly recognizes human capital development projects as a core capability. Now, our PSG should do the same, since productivity is boosted as much by human capital as it is by IT equipment. And while one may argue that workforce development grants do much the same thing, the WDG appears overly restrictive, reliant on an approved consultant panel, and isn't available on an ongoing basis. I believe the scope should be more flexible and allow SMEs to bolster compensation and benefits to better match starting salaries offered by the MSCs. Beyond salaries, job seekers may be attracted to work in SMEs because of the promise of greater work variety and flexibility, and greater exposure to business roles and functions. Internship and apprenticeship programs, including those from polytechnics, universities, and the graduate industry traineeship, or GRIT, should actively look to enfold SMEs into their slate of potential employers. The career conversion program should not be limited to the wholesale trade, but be expanded to encompass a wider range of SME sectors. That said, application and reporting requirements for these programs are often onerous, stretching the already thin resources of small businesses. While I accept the need for prudence in managing public funds, we should not turn SMEs into another government bureaucracy. There should be a simplified application process for grants, and reporting process requirements should focus on fraud audit rather than extensive documentation compliance. Moreover, funds are provided on a reimbursement basis at the moment. But any small business owner, especially one that is starting up, knows that one of the principal challenges that they face is sustaining cash flow. We should also reimburse any support we offer upfront and trust SME owners to deploy these grants wisely. Of course, supporting SMEs with young talent can occur even earlier upstream. SMEs in search of skilled workers often seek out interns. Unfortunately, many young would-be graduates remain unmatched to potential SME employers. And this is not for lack of trying. Most tertiary institutions already include a job exposure scheme, but take-up remains low. In 2024, ITE supplied 1,300 students, while AUs sent 800. This is despite how attachments often translate into jobs. And perhaps more important, SME participation remains low. Around 300 firms have joined such programs, which are less than 1% of registered SMEs. One factor behind the low take-up rates could be because companies that hope to partner with tertiary institutions must co-design and co-deliver bespoke curricula. This can be insurmountable for smaller companies with limited resources and understanding of how to go about doing so. It may be better to take a cue from the German approach, where more than 1 in 10 companies participate in their equivalent program by expanding the scope of potential applicants, allowing interns to be hired using Skills Future funds, and accepting simpler application criteria from SME employers. Yet even when directed toward hiring talent, there's little structure to ensure the systematic transfer of skills, such that the benefits of human capital are spread across the firm. That is especially the case for foreign talent. There's room to place greater emphasis on local capability development built into schemes such as the Pioneer Certificate incentives and Development and Expansion Initiative to better embed skills transfer to Singaporean employees. Larger grants, in particular, should be paired with a clear proposal and timetable for ensuring skills transfer, including the possibility of a sunset of foreign employment passes after a designated duration, if no additional transfer is taking place. And when local employees are sent for skills upgrading, employers of micro and small enterprises can be partially reimbursed with make-up pay to cover the costs of temporary hiring or overtime, similar to make-up pay when NS men fulfill their reservist commitments. So let me close.
Professor Lim, you have a minute left.
I hear you. To be clear, what I'm calling for is not a wholesale overhaul of our GLC-heavy, MNC-led, and foreign capital-reliant model, which has, to date, served us well. Sidelining these actors would amount to killing off the golden goose, which have established themselves as cornerstones of our corporate and industrial landscape. Our GLCs have also been increasingly competitive on international shores, projecting the economic influence of Singapore Inc. worldwide. Nor am I proposing that we abandon our foreign investment and shut the door to foreign capital flows. This will hollow out our capital base. No modern economy, much less a globalized one like ours, operates without due attention to international players. But what I am calling for are policy and institutional shifts that will usher in a changed mindset for how we should view our homegrown companies in an already wealthy, advanced economy. The shift will place small, but especially medium-sized firms at the beating heart of our nation's economic model, away from the interests of large, foreign-based MNCs, of even our GLC behemoths. What we need is creative destruction. By destroying, we will create simultaneously an economy ready for the 21st century.
Mr. Speaker, in May this year, the Economic Strategy Review presented 32 recommendations across 8 trusts, the product of 5 committees and consultations with more than 7,700 stakeholders, with the full report released in June. It is a serious piece of work and I commend those involved. But as I noted in this House last September, Singapore has never lacked task forces and committees. The Economic Strategies Committee in 2009, the Committee on the Future Economy in 2016, the Future Economy Council, the Industry Transformation Maps, the Emerging Stronger Task Force in 2020, and now the ESR and the Singapore Economic Resilience Task Force. At this rate, reviewing the economy risks becoming a growth industry in its own right. The ESR asks searching questions of our businesses and our workers. Sharpen our value proposition, be agile, be resilient. These are fair propositions, but there is one economic actor of whom the report asks remarkably little, the government itself, and specifically the government in its most lucrative role as our landlord. The state owns some 90% of the land in Singapore, and it is by a wide margin the biggest landlord in the country. My contention today is a simple one. The ESR's ambitions for enterprise and innovation will not be realized so long as the government continues to see itself as a landlord and as long as Singaporeans continue to share in the government's rentier mindset. In fact, even as economists often identify the key factors of production being land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, there is not a single mention of land in the 32 recommendations of the ESR report, even as the report itself had acknowledged that land, energy, and demographic constraints are expected to tighten. Mr. Speaker, rent-seeking behaviour permeates our society and the tone is set at the top. As I've shared in my speech at the opening of this term in Parliament, policy should not inadvertently reward the highest bidder at the expense of wider societal outcomes. And it is in upstream land costs that we must go further. State land forms part of our reserves, but excessive land prices push up development costs and rents, impacting tenants and companies and eventually consumers. As a local C-suite member of one of Asia's largest real estate groups has shared in the past, in Singapore, land costs now form roughly 70% of total project development expenditure, up from just 4% in the 1980s for Raffles City. These costs do not vanish. They cascade from developer to tenant, from tenant to hawker, clinic, shopkeeper, and finally to every consumer. Now, I anticipate the familiar reply that rental is not the largest cost businesses face. Indeed, when this House debated hawker culture, the Senior Minister of State cited an NEA survey showing that rental forms less than 10% of storeholders' operating costs, against 56% for raw materials and 20% for manpower. But this argument proves too little. Where does the hawker suppliers operate from? A rented industrial unit on state-priced land. Where does the wholesaler store his goods, the logistics firm park its lorries, the central kitchen prepares its ingredients, all on land whose price the state sets and extracts? High land prices feed into rentals, and rentals feed into every line of the cost structure, including the 56% we are told to look instead. Rent is not one cost amongst many. It is the cost embedded in all the others and an important fixed overhead that cannot be avoided. Members will recall the $52,000 monthly rental bid for a GB clinic in an HDB estate. Minister Ong Ye Kung himself acknowledged that this must feed through to healthcare costs one way or another, and that the highest rental bid does not deliver the best care for the community. I agreed with his view then, and I continue to hold this view. During this year's Committee of Supply, I appreciate that HDB is expanding the price quality method for commercial tenders of neighbourhood shops. But if we accept this logic downstream, at the level of a single shop tender, we must have the intellectual honesty to apply it upstream to land policy itself. Mr. Speaker, there is a structural reason why these costs keep rising. Our land sales system is built so that prices can only ratchet upwards. Sites are awarded to the highest bidder generally, subject to a reserve price that is not published for any individual site. When the market bids above the reserve, the land is sold and a new benchmark is set. When the market bids below it, the tender is simply not awarded, barring other specific circumstances, and the state waits for a better day. Heads, land prices rise. Tails, land prices are not allowed to fall. In a reply to my parliamentary question in July 2021, the Minister for Law disclosed that the reserve price is pegged to 85% of the estimated market value assessed by the Chief Valuer's Office, and that of the 133 sites launched for tender between 2016 and 2021, 17 were not awarded because the highest bids were deemed not reflective of the fair market value of the land. That is roughly 1 in 8 tenders aborted rather than allowed to clear at what the market was actually prepared to pay. The pattern continues in February 2024, where the URA declined to award the Marina Gardens Crescent White site because the sole bid of 770 million, or 984 per square foot per plot ratio, was assessed to be too low. The history of Paya Lebar Quarter, one of my favourite mixed-use sites in the east, tells the same story. In November 2011, URA rejected the sole bid from a consortium of UOL Group and Singapore Land for a mixed-use site in Paya Lebar Central at 529.5 million or 566 per square foot per plot ratio on the grounds that it was too low. The consortium asked for reserve prices to be made public given the cost and efforts of submission of such a scale. URA declined, saying disclosure would not be in the public interest. When the site was eventually tendered and awarded in April 2015, it was sold at 1.67 billion, or 943 per square foot per plot ratio, at a rate some 2/3 higher than the bid the government had earlier refused. The land waited 4 years, the price went up by about 2/3, the state coffers are higher by $1 billion, even as the site area is now bigger, and we saw private residential prices in the area reach new highs. After Park Place Residences was eventually launched. Is this a healthy development? The irony is that the government understands this perfectly well in certain cases. The NEA proudly sets no reserved rent at all for hawker store tenders since 2012 and does not set a minimum bid price for hawker store tenders. My first call, therefore, is that maximizing revenues from land and buildings should no longer be a primary consideration of land policy. As I've argued in this House before, we should bring back two-envelope concept and price tenders as the default for strategic and community-facing sites so that land is awarded on the quality and value of what is built and not simply to whoever bids the most. The government, as the biggest landlord of all, benefits, but it does so at everyone else's expense. The same logic applies to households. Home loans make up at least 70% of total household liabilities in Singapore, and mortgage borrowing grew 5.8% year-on-year in the first quarter of this year. Our own regulatory framework, the total debt servicing ratio, contemplates households committing up to 55% of gross monthly income to debt service obligations. A household servicing a 30-year mortgage at anywhere near that level does not leave the perceived security of a monthly paycheck to start a company with no visibility over cash inflows for years. It optimizes for the next paycheck because it must. Moreover, according to ADP research, 60% of workers in Singapore were living paycheck to paycheck as of 2024. What capital is there for entrepreneurship? It is no wonder that risk aversion in Singapore is not some cultural mystery but a lived balance sheet reality. That is why in the last term of Parliament, I moved an adjournment motion calling for rental housing to be developed as a genuine housing model and not merely a residual safety net for those with no other options. The build-to-own model has served asset accumulation well, but it front-loads a lifetime of leverage onto Singaporeans in precisely the decades when they are most able to take entrepreneurial risk. And in many other global cities, young professionals rent for years without stigma, preserving the flexibility to move, retrain and build. My second call is therefore for a meaningful public rental option for young and middle-income income Singaporeans with 10-year security and rents set with reference to income rather than market value. We already have a variant of this in the Parenthood Provisional Housing Scheme for married or engaged couples with more modest incomes and who wish to rent a temporary flat while waiting for their new home to be built. If we want a generation of founders, we should stop shackling them to mortgages in their 20s and 30s. Mr. Speaker, since the government seems to relish its position as being the largest landlord in the country, let me offer a new estate to develop. In the AI economy, compute is to value creation what land was to the industrial economy, the scarce foundational input on which everything else is built. We have made a start, and I acknowledge that an enterprise compute initiative was announced at Budget 2025 with up to 150 million of funding support. This is, however, only meant to be a short-term program that will only run for 1 year for the respective launch dates of each cloud service provider. By October 2025, he had reportedly had some 1,000 firms with cloud partners, but this is a very modest figure as compared to the 385,000 or so firms in Singapore's enterprise landscape in 2024 as identified in the ESR's final report. I also recognize that NTUC's AI Ready SG subsidizes half the subscription cost of eligible AI tools for members if you first go for an approved course. In other words, the principle of subsidized access to compute has been accepted by the government. The questions that remain are of scale, duration, and ambition. Some examples from overseas may be instructive. Hong Kong built its own artificial intelligence supercomputing center at Cyberport and allocated 3 billion Hong Kong dollars to a 3-year AI subsidy scheme under which eligible users receive subsidies of up to 70% of center's service list price. There is a state-owned facility with a publish rate card and a discount. Canada's sovereign AI compute strategy pairs public supercomputing investment with a 300 million Canadian dollars access fund that covers 2/3 of eligible costs for local cloud-based AI computing services on projects with compute costs of up to 5 million Canadian dollars. Note the word local and that these are targeted at SMEs. The United Kingdom, having found itself with only 1.3% of global compute capacity in late 2022, committed up to £2 billion by 2030 under its compute roadmap, and its AI research resource now allocates compute directly. 10,000 GPU hours for first-time users and 20,000 GPU hours for small and medium enterprises awarded as capacity rather than cash. Consider also the asymmetry closer to home. We extract some 20 billion in a single year in land sales proceeds or so, and yet we are only setting aside 150 million for the digital land on which our own companies must build, and 1 billion over 5 years in overall national AI research. And for all our first place finishers in AI readiness, only 4% of firms had embedded AI into core business processes by 2026, with adoption at 15% among SMEs against 63% for larger firms. AI diffusion is a big concern. I could not have summed it up better than a 2025 World Bank report on digital progress and trends report that governments should create an enabling environment to facilitate access to compute resources, catalyzing AI adoption, adaptation, and innovation. This can include targeted interventions such as compute subsidies for small and medium enterprises and researchers, regional data centers, and public-private partnership. More recently, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang also remarked that a strong AI ecosystem is not a foregone conclusion. Policymakers have an important opportunity to act, such as through expanding access to compute for startups and researchers and investing in shared training assets. This is not a one-off or time-limited effort, but instead we should spare no effort until a significant majority of our local enterprises have truly embedded AI into their core business processes. My third call is therefore a so-called HDB model for compute. The HDB public housing model made the government's objective of home ownership for the people program during our early years attainable through subsidized access to state land. Similarly, a national compute program should offer subsidized allocated capacity to local companies and particularly SMEs and entrepreneurs. This would draw on capacity in which the state has an ownership interest, priced below market with a published rate card with tenure certainty, and eligibility weighted towards local ownership and local value capture. As what Liang Wenfeng, CEO of DeepSeek, said recently, 人才的差距本质上也是因为算力的差距. Let us not have a talent gap in Singapore simply because of a lack of access to compute. Mr. Speaker, I can already anticipate the government's response to the proposals I have raised, that pricing land or compute below the highest market bid amounts to raiding the reserves. Allow me 3 responses. First, the reserves belong to all Singaporeans, not to the government of the day. Foregone rent extraction that flows into the productive capacity of Singaporean households and firms is not a raid, but an investment in our collective future. It is the owners of the reserves investing in themselves. Second, on the government's own explanation to this House, leasehold land reverts to the state at the end of its term and is protected as past reserve once again. The debate is therefore about the pricing philosophy for the use of land over 99 years, not about giving the freehold away. Third, we do not apply this stinginess to foreign investment promotion. We extend generous low-tax incentives and charge as low as 5% corporate income tax instead of 17% to attract multinational corporations via a series of incentive schemes. Why is a discount for a foreign MNC prudent economic strategy, but a discount for a Singaporean entrepreneur a raid on the reserves?
Mr. Speaker, the Economic Strategy Review is organized around workers adapting again and again. It proposes training, pathways, and career bridges between jobs, but it gives far less attention to the all-important first transition from education or national service into stable work, and to whether young people get a fair start. In February, during the budget debate, I called this phenomenon the broken bottom rung of the career ladder. When young Singaporeans are unable to make that first meaningful step, the first job is where someone takes a chance on you. It is where you gain the experience that every subsequent employer expects you to have. A young person cannot create that opportunity alone. When firms stop taking chances on beginners, Singapore eventually stops producing experienced workers. Today, I want to ask the government a practical question. If a young Singaporean has prepared for work, searched earnestly, and still cannot secure stable employment, what must change so that their sustained effort can lead them somewhere? Today, most graduates still manage to find work. Among autonomous university graduates in the labour force, those who secure employment of any kind within 6 months of completing their final examinations amounted to 88.9% of the 2025 cohort, a slight drop from 91.2% in 2024. So 8 out of 9 graduates found work last year. But that figure is a broad measure. It includes graduates in full-time permanent employment, but also those in part-time, temporary, or freelance work, those who have accepted a job that starts later, and those taking steps to start a business. However, those in full-time permanent employment amounted to 74.4% of the cohort last year, down from 79.4% the previous year. So that means only 3 out of 4, down from 4 out of 5, found more stable long-term roles and could start building an actual career. I will not sound the klaxons just yet, but these are among several worrying signals, both in Singapore and from around the world, that it is getting harder for our youngest among us to find work. The signals grow stronger when we look across different educational paths. Among surveyed fresh graduates from full-time external degree programs at private education institutions, 78.9% secured employment and 46.9% were in full-time permanent employment. So another 24% were in part-time or temporary work, including 9.7% who said this was involuntary. It is clearly not a bed of roses for everyone. The transition into stable work looks materially different depending on where you graduated. Now, behind these figures are young people who have done what was asked of them and still cannot get started. I've heard from young graduates who told me about searches running into the hundreds of applications. One submitted more than 500 applications over 6 months and received few interviews. Another submitted close to 200 in 4 months without securing a single one. For these young people, the first transition meant repeated effort, very little response, and no clear place to turn should their efforts repeatedly fail to net a reward. A confluence of factors is likely driving the cooling job market for young Singaporeans, with the increased adoption of both artificial intelligence and old-school technological and productivity advancements. A firm may make the entirely rational decision to automate away the basic tasks once given to junior employees. It may decide that training a beginner is too costly in today's high-cost environment, and when that person can ultimately leave after gaining critical experience. Now take those same rational decisions and scale them across the economy, and we can start to see the problem. If every firm, local companies and global enterprises alike makes the same calculation, the economic engine gradually stops producing experienced workers. What works for one company's balance sheet damages the national workforce. The government has introduced several measures to support the transition into work. The SG Youth Plan has introduced job tasters to help young people explore an occupation. Training helps them prepare. Matching services connect them to vacancies. Work study and company-led training can combine a real job with structured workplace training. However, each helps at a different stage. Taken together, however, a young person can still move from exposure to training to job matching without getting a fair start. Exposure is useful, but exposure is not employment. That is the gap we must fill. And Mr. Speaker, that is why I propose a fair start promise to all our youth, a national commitment to work towards a simple goal. If you are a young Singaporean under 30, making the transition from education or national service into working life, that you will get a fair start through stable employment or proper paid career building pathway. That means we must rebuild the broken bottom rung of the career ladder. The establishment of the Skills and Workforce Development Agency, or the SWDA, gives us an important opportunity to make this promise real. By bringing skills and employment under one roof, the government can now judge the whole journey by one outcome, whether young Singaporeans actually get a fair start. The government should make fulfilling the Fair Start promise a core mission of the SWDA, with stage targets to show whether Singapore is moving closer to the goal. For the individual young Singaporean, what this means is targeted and individualized support from SWDA case officers, and that should begin early. 6 months into the transition is a sensible checkpoint at which to assess outcomes. Any young person still searching at that point should continue to receive active support, and no one should be left to flounder alone. But a national goal alone will not create opportunities. So we must create more genuine pathways for young people to get their fair start. First, we should open more ordinary entry-level jobs to capable beginners. Where an employer has real work that can develop a beginner through the ordinary course of employment, the priority should be that proper job. My colleague Eileen Chong spoke during the SWDA bill debate about the implementation gap in skills-based hiring. Singapore has produced toolkits and established institutions to promote this, but we still do not know clearly whether employers are changing how they hire or if they are lagging behind. She called for the public service to lead by example and for a published baseline tracking skills-based job postings by sector and employer size. I support these proposals. I have also previously proposed that the Careers and Skills Passport evolve from a digital filing cabinet into a dynamic living credential. I now propose expanding that idea, making it work better for hiring. The passport already allows Singaporeans to share verified qualifications, training, and employment records with employers. For a fresh graduate, however, that record will naturally be thinner. The SWDA should establish standards through which institutes of higher learning and employers can verify substantial projects, internships, work-study learning stints, and other assessed competencies through the Careers and Skills Passport. Employers should then match the evidence to the actual skills required for the job, and where appropriate, let applicants demonstrate these skills through a structured practical assessment. The public service should apply the same discipline to its own entry-level roles. Identify what must be genuinely known on the first day, remove degree and prior experience requirements that cannot be justified, and publish whether its hiring practices are changing. The government should, again, lead by example. These measures would improve the match between capable beginners and entry-level jobs that already exist in the market. But matching alone cannot build the workplace experience that some jobs genuinely require, and Singapore must therefore also create more places where beginners can acquire it. That brings me to my second point. We should build proper paid apprenticeships. In some occupations, competence can only be built through sustained supervised practice. Employers want experience because the work genuinely takes time to learn. Yet every firm has an incentive to wait for another firm to bear the cost of producing that experienced worker. Singapore already has workplace programs for young entrants. GRIT, for example, offers a 3 to 6 month allowance-based traineeship that can provide useful short-term experience. But where an occupation requires sustained supervised practice over a longer period of time, we need a different, more well-developed route, a proper apprenticeship framework providing paid employment, full employee status, CPF, structured training, and portable competencies. That is why Singapore should build a national market for proper paid apprenticeships. The SWDA should identify occupations where employers need workers, but beginners need sustained workplace training, and work with employers and sector bodies to expand apprenticeship places that meet a common quality floor. That means recruiting firms and coordinating the teaching, assessment, and supervision needed to build competence, while making sure every place provides enough real work. Shared capacity is especially important for SMEs. A smaller firm may have valuable work but lack a training department, a full curriculum, or enough varied tasks to train an apprentice alone. Sector bodies and consortia can provide common teaching roving mentors and independent assessment while coordinating rotations between these SMEs where these are needed to fully develop a range of competence. Employers would still provide the job and the wages and the workplace supervision, as well as their own share of investment. The quality floor must be clear. A proper apprenticeship is paid employment. It should carry a contract of service, wages, CPF, and ordinary workplace protections. The apprentice should perform productive work, learn through a structured plan, and have a named mentor. Wages should progress with competence. These skills should also be recognized independently of any one employer and carry value elsewhere across the market. The same employer need not guarantee permanent conversion, but before the pathway ends, there should be credible decision on conversion or progression. The government should support the shared infrastructure and portable occupational training that individual firms are unlikely to provide alone. Employers must remain substantial investors from the first day. That is the bargain we strike. Government solves the coordination problem, firms provide real work and help build the worker. Proper apprenticeships are central to a fair start for young people, and the same principles have wider application across the economy. My colleague, Mr. Gerald Giam, will speak next about the application to the skilled trades, where verified competence should lead to recognized mastery and real progression. Third, the government should use its economic leverage to create genuinely additional job opportunities. Some employers have productive work, but still hesitate to hire a beginner because of the initial wages, supervision, and lower productivity. The government can change that decision selectively. One lever is expanding targeted temporary risk-sharing arrangements. Support should be available where an employer can show that it will create a genuine additional employee job or proper apprenticeship, and that the opening would not proceed on the same terms without help. The employer must contribute throughout and take responsibility for wages, CPF, real work supervision, and development. Another lever is public procurement, where workforce development is relevant to a substantial public contract. Procuring agencies can require or recognize proportionate commitments to proper apprenticeships and genuine employee entry-level roles. The purpose is to connect public purchasing demand to the development of Singapore's future workforce, without imposing a blanket quota on every contractor. Both levers should face the same test. Did public intervention change the employer's decision and create a productive opportunity that would not otherwise have existed? Public money should not be paying for employers to relabel planned vacancies, displace existing workers, or cycle young workers through temporary seats. Support should depend on additional work and real development. Money should be recovered where employer misrepresents the role or fails to provide the job, wages, or development promise. These measures will not eliminate every difficult transition for our youth, but they can, however, increase the number of genuine first opportunities without compelling private employers to hire or manufacturing make work in the economy. Finally, we must measure whether young people actually get that fair start. The fair start promise should be judged by whether they enter stable employment or a proper paid career building pathway and can build from there. The SWDA should The SWDA should publish a baseline and stage targets for these outcomes. It should report whether employment lasts, whether job responsibilities and wages progress, and whether the results differ across different groups. The results must also show how many young people remain without stable employment at the critical 6-month mark. For how long and for what broad reasons? A youth should not disappear from the figures because a referral failed or a program ended. Keeping these outcomes visible will show where vacancies, training capacity, or practical support remain inadequate. A downturn may also make progress towards the Fair Start promise harder. That is when honest measurement matters most. It tells Parliament and the public how much opportunity has disappeared and whether the national response is strong enough. The Fair Start promise sets the national ambition. The 3 proposals I suggested are practical ways to move closer towards making that a reality: opening existing jobs to capable beginners with skills-based hiring, building proper paid apprenticeships, and creating additional opportunities where public intervention changes the calculus and the hiring decision for any employer. Transparent results will also show where progress is being made and where the government must do more. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, the Fair Start promise asks something of everyone. Young people must prepare, search earnestly, and engage with suitable opportunities. Employers must provide real jobs and invest in beginners. The government must build the conditions in which sustained effort can lead to progress and lead to a stable career. The government must not stand aside when every employer waits for someone else to provide a first chance. It must not let young people disappear between programs and institutions.
Mr. Speaker, for decades, skilled tradespersons, from electricians and plumbers to lift engineers and infrastructure and technicians, have not been accorded the prestige and pay that match their vital economic contributions. We have relied on foreign labor arbitrage and allowed unlicensed workers to perform tasks meant for certified practitioners, inevitably suppressing local trade earnings over time. With a median monthly income of just $2,700 in 2023, skilled trades are seldom seen as a career of first choice for young Singaporeans. Over the past decade, the local craft workforce has shrunk by 40 to 50%. Of the 186,000 craftsmen and trades workers in Singapore, only 28% are locals, and their ranks are aging, with a median age of 56 years old. Yet, skilled tradespersons form the bedrock of our national infrastructure. While artificial intelligence can automate administrative reports and overseas remote workers can process corporate accounts, they cannot physically rewire a server room, repair a water main, or maintain critical infrastructure in Singapore. These crafts are inherently localized, highly skilled, and resistant to remote replacement. If we want to offer genuine economic mobility to our vocational graduates, we cannot leave the skilled trades trapped by undercutting from unlicensed workers, rigid licensing regimes, and limited career progression pathways. We must elevate these vocations into respected, high-earning avenues of trade entrepreneurship and national pride. While upskilling is essential, classroom retraining has limited utility in technical crafts compared to master-led apprenticeships. And training alone cannot resolve deeper market distortions. As we look to elevate skilled technical vocations, relying on frameworks patterned after the progressive wage model or the career progression model will reach natural structural limits. While these models establish important wage floors across foundational sectors, their design relies heavily on climbing fixed corporate ladders into administrative or supervisory roles, positions that are inherently limited in number and compel artisans to abandon their practical craft just to earn a higher income. To enable our artisans to achieve true long-term wage progression, we must look beyond administrative ladders and restructure the underlying market so that technical mastery naturally commands the true market value of their craft. To achieve this, we must introduce a market-friendly trade competency framework that elevates skilled trades into highly respected avenues of independent enterprise and professional advancement. We must enable tradespersons to contribute to and build prosperous, scalable businesses, ensuring they do not feel stuck in demanding jobs with limited prospects. The Economic Strategy Review report rightly acknowledges that essential physical trades are vital to Singapore's economic resilience. However, its recommendations continue to rely on incremental tweaks within employer-led models. While the ESR points to outsourcing and weak skills recognition, it remains silent on the deeper structural distortions depressing trade wages. The report features an inspiring young electrician whose grit is truly commendable. Yet his pathway is telling. Unlocking high earnings required 4 academic degrees, including a master's degree, from NITEC all the way to a master's degree. I applaud his drive, but question the system. Why force a master craftsman through an academic obstacle course instead of directly valuing hands-on mastery and independent enterprise? This paradigm shift must begin with how these essential vocations are regulated and protected in the open market. Consider all our current licensing regimes. Almost all fixed electrical work legally requires an EMA licensed electrical worker, while regulated plumbing requires a PUB licensed plumber. While non-compliance carries statutory fines of up to $10,000, a jail term of up to 3 years or both, daily practice reveals a massive gap between the rates charged by licensed tradespersons and unregulated marketplace alternatives. This economic gap tempts cash-constrained buyers to opt for uncertified options across many routine property maintenance tasks. Such choices carry serious public safety risks. Uncertified electrical work can cause loose connections, arcing, structural fires, or electrocution, while improper plumbing joints can lead to concealed leaks, sewage backflow, or water supply contamination. In 2016, the improper wiring of a water heater to a 3-pin plug by workers unlicensed to do electrical work resulted in the tragic electrocution of a 15-year-old boy in his HDB flat. Similarly, in 2020, an elderly couple and their son were electrocuted to death in their Jurong flat due to similar unsafe installation of a water heater. To protect public safety and shield local artisans from wage-depressing undercutting, regulators, including EMA and PUB, must enforce strict regulatory baselines for all market players, whether local or foreign, to ensure local artisans compete on a true level playing field of technical quality and safety. This will require the agencies to staff sufficient inspectors and auditors to conduct enforcement and respond to whistleblowing complaints. Second, we must streamline how local talent enters and moves through the vocational talent pipeline. Local manpower supply is currently constrained by rigid structures that force junior workers and mid-career entrants through a long, uncertain route just to secure a license. We should promote the skilled trades to students and mid-career switches as viable, respected alternatives to polytechnic diplomas and university degrees. Training pathways already exist, whether through full-time IT programs or certification courses at the BCA Academy or Singapore Institute of Power and Gas for mid-career switchers. However, despite completing their classroom education, aspiring tradespersons face structural challenges when attempting to translate those qualifications into licensed independent careers. The structural bottleneck lies in the post-graduation licensing requirements of completing 2 years of relevant practical experience, covering a full spectrum of trade work. Trade practitioners I spoke to have highlighted that, in reality, almost no small contractor covers the entire spectrum of work. Expecting a residential service plumber to log experience across industrial supply systems creates a practical bottleneck, as current evaluation criteria favor multi-year commercial construction projects over day-to-day residential maintenance. We can resolve the licensing bottleneck by implementing a modular trade endorsement pathway. Instead of requiring 2 years of full-spectrum experience before a worker can practice independently, this pathway certifies specific verified competencies task by task. Each cleared module would legally authorize a tradesperson for that specific scope of work, whether in water heater installations, sanitary piping, or wiring loops. These milestones are verified via hands-on practical assessments, customer ratings, and structured peer reviews by master practitioners. This allows local apprentices to start practicing legally and earning a respectable living for the tasks they have mastered, while progressively expanding their certified scope over time. To operationalize these modular endorsements, we need a modern digital architecture, an official tradesperson skills ledger platform. This platform serves a dual purpose. It allows tradespersons to log task-specific trade endorsements verified under the supervision of licensed artisans, creating an immutable record of their practical milestones. It can also double as a national trades marketplace, connecting buyers, both enterprises and homeowners, directly with licensed tradespersons based on verified modular competencies, domain expertise, and clear rate schedules set transparently by the artisans themselves. Clear benchmark call-out rate bands can be established, providing upfront price transparency for property owners while guaranteeing fair off-hours compensation for artisans, eliminating both predatory surge gouging and artificial wage caps. By streamlining, matching, and reducing administrative overhead for both small contractors and buyers, the system enables tradespersons to establish sustainable commercial clients, secure corporate procurement contracts, and build long-term business equity. Fourth, we must eliminate the structural over-reliance on an employer's sole discretion to advance an apprentice's career. Across skilled trades, the government currently enforces safety through a rigid employer-tied licensing requirements, inadvertently granting employers veto power over an entry-level worker's advancement. Under the current market structure, established employers have little commercial incentive to sign off on the logbooks and testimonials of apprentices, who may later become direct competitors. While on-the-job training under senior practitioners remains essential, we must ensure that if an apprentice faces unreasonable administrative delays or employer gatekeeping, an independent audit mechanism exists. An apprentice should be able to submit their immutable digital work logs and project portfolios to an independent technical panel for verification. This preserves direct supervisory accountability while protecting apprentices from career stagnation and employer holdup. Finally, to tie these pillars together, I propose establishing a new autonomous entity called the Singapore Guild of Skilled Tradespersons, which will define baseline competencies, advocate for fair commercial rates, manage the tradesperson skills ledger, and empower local tradespersons to self-regulate and scale their operations. Existing industry bodies like the Singapore Plumbing Society, the Singapore Electrical Contractors and Licensed Electrical Workers Association, and the Specialist Trade Alliance of Singapore possess relevant sectorial familiarity. These trade societies can be reformed and integrated as dedicated chambers under this guild. This will give every tradesperson a direct voice, remove corporate employer gatekeeping, and empower artisans to govern their craft under a self-regulatory model similar to those enjoyed by doctors, engineers, and accountants. Under this four-sided partnership of shared accountability, employers provide structured apprenticeships with all progress and milestones logged transparently in the tradesperson skills ledger. The Singapore Guild of Skilled Tradespersons acts as an independent quality auditor and serves as a safety guardian. Tradespersons maintain verified digital profiles and direct statutory accountability for work within their endorsed scope. And consumers gain direct access to a trusted, transparent marketplace with verified quality assurance. Mr. Speaker, elevating our physical crafts requires more than just policy tweaks. It demands restoring the social standing and institutional dignity of our artisans. When we give skilled tradespersons the autonomy to govern their own professions, command transparent commercial returns for their mastery, and build independent, high-earning businesses, we can fundamentally change how society views this form of blue-collar work. By replacing rigid academic treadmills with direct market rewards for technical excellence, entering a trade will no longer be seen as a second-best option born of academic detour, but a proud, lucrative, and respected pathway into entrepreneurship and master craftsmanship. Through independent representation, technology-driven competency tracking, and structured apprenticeships, this comprehensive structural redesign will restore our workers' leverage and ensure that national economic progress serves the dignity and prosperity of every Singaporean. So I support the original motion standing in the names of my honourable friends, Mr. Kenneth Tiong, the member for Aljunied GRC, and Associate Professor Jamus Lim, the member for Sengkang GRC.
Mr. Speaker, I speak today in support of the original motion filed by my honourable friends, AP Jamus Lim and Mr. Kenneth Tiong. The Economic Strategy Review recognizes that the global economy is changing in ways that are structural rather than cyclical. My speech will focus on the Thrusts 6 and 7 of the ESR. While their broad aims are laudable, I hope to advance some different recommendations for consideration in the shared hope and spirit of better preparing and protecting our Singaporean workers. I will frame my suggestions through 3 questions. The first question concerns the journey. What is the journey for Singaporean workers who find themselves displaced in the workforce or at risk of being made obsolete? The second question is about the destination. What is the destination for those who undertake skills training or upgrading? And how can we ensure that such retraining or upskilling results in a job on the other side? The third question ties the previous 2 together. What is the proof that our continuing education system actually works? Mr. Speaker, I begin with my first question. What is the journey like for Singaporeans who undertake reskilling or retraining opportunities? More importantly, how can we make sure that these workers can and do benefit from these opportunities? And what can be done to make the journey easier for them? My answer is twofold. One is to offer a robust safety net so that workers, especially those who are displaced, can pursue retraining and reskilling opportunities without anxiety or worry. 2 is to unlock sources of funding for those who may wish to pursue deeper mid-career upskilling. Sir, Singaporean workers deserve a robust safety net. Upskilling and retraining sounds good in the abstract as a response to job displacement. But we have to remember that Singaporean workers are not video game characters progressing through a skill tree to get an achievement unlocked. To workers made redundant or on the verge of losing their jobs, upskilling and retraining may not sound like solutions in the immediate moment, but rather as another source of stress and uncertainty. Let us not understate the psychological distress and desperation that precarious employment can cause. Other than anxiety and disappointment, workers can also feel shame and embarrassment, especially if they are breadwinners with children or elderly depending on them. We must thus manage workforce transformations and transitions with sensitivity. We need our Singaporean workers to feel secure and have confidence that they can and will overcome an employment disruption if and when they face one. And we need affected workers to be confident that they have the full backing of society and the government as they endeavour to overcome this setback. Sir, that sense of security, hope, and confidence can only come by offering our workers the protection of a robust safety net, namely through 1, mandatory retrenchment benefits, and 2, a universal redundancy insurance scheme. Mr. Speaker, the ESR in Thrust 6 calls for earlier intervention in retrenchment support. Early intervention makes sense. However, I want to ask whether this alone is sufficient or even fair for the affected workers, who have sometimes contributed years of service. Crucially, employers are encouraged to abide by the tripartite advisory on responsible retrenchment. As a result, retrenchment benefits remain at the discretion of the respective employers. This is a policy choice that unfairly disadvantages our workers and leaves them vulnerable. To me, this is wrong. We must protect hardworking Singaporeans and legislate mandatory retrenchment benefits. So now I turn to another concern raised in Thrust 6 of the ESR about strengthening support for our professional managers and executives. We believe that a redundancy insurance scheme offers better protection for all workers, including our PMEs. In contrast to the Skills Future Job Seeker Support Scheme, our proposal is meant to be universal and funded by joint contributions from both employers and employees, amounting to a combined 0.1% of the worker's monthly salary. And because every worker pays into it, every worker will be eligible to benefit from it. The basic idea for each retrenched worker is to receive 40% of their last drawn salary, which will be further capped at 40% of Singapore's prevailing median income. These payouts will last up to 6 months at most. Sir, one of the advantages of our redundancy insurance scheme is that the payouts are straightforward. Workers will not have to go through an application process or face an agonizing wait about the outcome, or stress themselves out further about what they should do if their application was rejected. Our proposal offers displaced workers the assurance, peace of mind, and financial buffer to properly reskill and seek better job fit, since the worker would not need to jump at the first offer that comes along. This will also reduce the prospect of underemployment. Mr. Speaker, at this point, I can already hear murmurs about moral hazard from honourable colleagues across the aisles. I want to reassure them that our redundancy insurance features the following 4 C's to address this. The 4 C's are coverage, conditionality, caps, and cushion. First, coverage is restricted only to cases of involuntary redundancy, thus eliminating the concerns that workers may quit in order to collect benefits. Second, conditionality payouts for the second and subsequent months will be made conditional on the individual's job searching and or retraining efforts. Third, caps. The payouts are modest and limited by a double 40 cap. That is, only 40% of the last drawn salary, which is also further subjected to a cap at 40% of median income. Lastly, cushion. These payouts are time-limited and not meant to fully replace lost income. Rather, it is intended to merely cushion the harsh impact of retrenchment and provide a semblance of security and assurance the worker and his or her family and dependents in their immediate future. Beyond the 4 C's, Mr. Speaker, let me make a more fundamental point about the redundancy insurance scheme. Here, I'm glad to see that the Prime Minister is here in the House, because he would perhaps best appreciate how our universal redundancy insurance scheme can reflect and foster a we-first spirit by pooling our resources collectively and engaging in risk sharing. It is a reminder that all of us Singaporeans are in this together and that we mutually help and support each other when things get difficult. So I return back to the question about the journey. What else can we do to better support workers who are retraining or upskilling? And what I want to suggest here is especially pertinent for Singaporeans who have spent time in the workforce and may now want to upskill in a major and deeper way. This could mean taking on a postgraduate degree. In doing so, workers would then gain the qualifications and competencies needed to either value add to their current work or even to pivot to new industries. However, such deep upskilling is often more demanding, very time and energy intensive, and involves a longer-term commitment. It can also be financially exacting. Here I am in agreement with ESR's diagnosis and recommendation in Trust 7, which calls for expanding funding support to cover a broader range of deeper reskilling pathways, including postgraduate programs offered by IHLs. I have 2 specific proposals in this regard. First, the government should directly offer mid-career Singaporeans undertaking a postgraduate degree with access to education loans that are interest-free for at least the duration of their course, and with repayments to start at a modest rate before progressively increasing after a certain period. What I have in mind here is something like the Mendaki study loans, which has a repayment arrangement that scales up over a period of time. Second, the government should expand the CPF education loan scheme to cover part-time and full-time master's programs at our IHLs. This is currently not possible. Finding the funding for postgraduate studies is often a challenge for many working professionals. Yet postgraduate degrees remain useful in improving employability. For instance, employers sometimes reduce the years of working experience needed for applicants with a postgraduate degree. So these suggestions partly emerged from my own experience of pursuing a mid-career switch a few years ago. I left the public service to pursue a postgraduate JD program at SMU to become a lawyer. The temporary transition back to being a full-time student was difficult, not least due to the loss of a stable income for the 3 years of the JD program. However, securing an interest-free education loan from Mendaki was helpful for me. Also, while being a JD student, I was in a slightly better financial place as a result of holding a master's in sociology. That enabled me to secure part-time employment teaching at SIM, which helped me with my day-to-day expenses. Today, retraining and upskilling is something unavoidable for the Singaporean worker. However, we in this House would do well to recognize that the process of retraining, and especially deeper upskilling, involves opportunity and real costs, some of which can and should be alleviated. Mr. Speaker, I now arrive at my second question, the destination. Training by itself is not an economic outcome, and obtaining a certificate does not necessarily translate into a livelihood. If retraining ends with a worker returning home to search job portals alone, then we have merely replaced one form of insecurity with another. I am thus encouraged by the opportunity presented last month by the merger of Skills Future Singapore and Workforce Singapore into a single statutory board. The Skills and Workforce Development Agency has the potential to serve a new integrated system where workers can be supported actively by the state throughout the entire process of displacement, retraining, job matching, and re-employment. I believe this is in line with recommendation in Thrust 7 of the ESR. As such, the SWDA should avoid merely becoming a larger training administrator. Instead, it should be connecting together employers, training providers, and workers so that retraining culminates in a real opportunity for employment. The SWDA should serve as a premier one-stop employment center where every involuntary unemployed job seeker can be assigned with a dedicated caseworker. Job seekers will meet with a caseworker for one-on-one guidance on the job search process. After a careful consideration of the job seeker's circumstances, skills and experience, as well as the expected vacancies in the job market, the caseworker can then either match the job seekers to available jobs or else recommend retraining or upskilling courses that can prepare these job seekers to transition into another role. To properly fulfill this bridging and matching function, SWDA will have to do two things in tandem. One, tracking the macro developments in the job sector, and two, ensuring that its program offerings are fit for purpose. The first task is for the SWDA to have a good understanding of the ever-evolving needs and demands of the job market so that they can better match or train job seekers for these jobs. Here, SWDA can work with employers to understand which sectors are expanding, which firms are expected to have vacancies over the next 6 to 12 months, and which industries face persistent worker shortages. The second task requires the SWDA to build a culture of rigorous evaluation so that taxpayers' monies are funding courses and training programs that actually provide good employment outcomes for workers, or at the very least provide skills needed by the industry. For example, in many industries, there are companies that compete commercially but require many of the same foundational competencies. SWDA can work with industry partners to build training programs that focus on sector-wide skills during the first few months, followed by a shorter company-specific immersion. SWDA should also work with industry professionals to design training curricula for workers. It should regularly collect employers' requirements across each industry, or perhaps even receive curricular proposals from these employers, as suggested before by two of my honourable friends, Mr. Gerald Giam and AP Jamus Lim. Training providers that should then demonstrate how their own programs meet these industry's identified needs. And if this is not the case already, industry representatives should sit on curriculum steering committees. Skills future providers should also be governed by tougher quality assurance frameworks with frequent audits of providers and trainers. There should also be industry input on the assessment standards for Skills Future courses. Every Skills Future program, from curriculum to assessment, should require sign-off from 3 stakeholders: an employer or industry representative, the government, and the training provider. Finally, SWDA should work with employers to provide probationary opportunities for successful graduates from Skill Futures programs. This will demonstrate that there are solid training programs that can prepare workers to enter new jobs or new industries. I believe that a new SWDA can best serve our workforce by becoming the national convener for matching displaced workers, employers, and training institutions into a single coherent system of retraining and rehiring. The SWDA can then develop a niche in creating the career bridges which the ESR talks about in Thrust 6, those structured pathways for at-risk workers to gain employment in more resilient occupations. Mr. Speaker, my third question is on the proof. How can we be confident that our system of continuing education actually works? Where is the evidence to tell us that our training programs actually succeed? We spend billions of dollars supporting workforce development, but surprisingly little outcome data enters the public domain. We know, for example, that around 55% of previously unemployed trainees who participated in the Skills Future Career Transition Program found new jobs within 6 months. But we do not know which courses perform better at helping trainees find new jobs, which providers consistently deliver stronger outcomes, whether wages rise after retraining, and whether workers remain employed 1 year later. I understand that Skill Future and continuing education more generally should not be narrowly evaluated in terms of employment outcomes. Skill Future also serves the purposes of enrichment and lifelong learning, which is why one of my honorable colleagues shared with me, even her 88-year-old mother receives Skill Futures credit. However, Mr. Speaker, the point remains, if the government is primarily relying on Skills Future as a platform to deliver workforce retraining and upskilling, then surely our evaluation of Skills Future and its offerings must reflect that priority. The government should thus publish more metrics to help workers assess the effectiveness of specific Skills Future programs in relation to employment prospects. For example, for each provider and course, we should publish how many trainees found new jobs within 6 months and the average wages of these new jobs. The availability of such data would transform accountability throughout our training ecosystem. Providers would be forced to compete on outcomes rather than marketing, and workers would make better informed decisions before going for training. Government funding should then flow towards programs that demonstrably succeed. Mr. Speaker, one last point on why we invest in the upskilling of our workers. Singapore has built one of the world's most generous systems of continuing education. Without a doubt, the government has invested significantly in our people. But as always is the case with government expenditure, where the money goes and how it is spent matters as much as how much is spent. The recently released report of the Auditor General raises questions about whether the money has been fruitfully used. The AGO flagged some issues with the Career Conversion Program and Mid-Career Pathways Program. In page 65 of the report, the AGO found that 6 groups of 30 related entities had engaged in patterns that suggested, and I quote, potential gaming of the programs to maximize grant claims rather than genuine training initiatives. While I understand that Workforce Singapore has addressed some of these findings, my concern is about the vulnerabilities in the system that can be exploited. The government must remain vigilant in detecting any abuse of the system and plugging these gaps, so to ensure public monies can deliver genuine training of our workforce. Because every dollar diverted and wasted is a dollar not spent to retrain or upskill a worker to stay employable. And we must ensure that taxpayers' money we spend to support reskilling and career conversion should produce genuine workforce outcomes and meaningfully help displaced workers rebuild their careers. To recap the proposals in my speech: 1. Legislating mandatory retrenchment benefits. 2. Implementing universal redundancy insurance. 3. Introducing interest-free education loans and allowing CPF to be used for postgraduate studies. 4. Consolidating SWDA into a one-stop shop for employment and upskilling with dedicated caseworkers. 5. Collaborating more closely with industry partners to fine-tune Skills Future offerings and curricula. And 6. Publishing more public outcome data by provider and course. Mr. Speaker, the ESR rightly observes that Singapore's greatest asset has always been its people. And to maximize our competitive advantage, we must enable Singaporeans to move confidently from one stage of their working lives to another. Ideally, the worker should begin retraining or upskilling with a clear idea of the destination ahead. He or she should be able to see, right from the start, a credible career bridge, rather than resting on some vague hope that retraining will lead to some hazy notion of somewhere better. With that, I reiterate my support for the original motion.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the original motion. The full report of the Economic Strategy Review, or ESR, released on the 24th of June, goes to the heart of what kind of economy and what kind of society we want to build for Singapore and for our workers. It is situated within a world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence, technological disruption, geopolitical fragmentation, and intensifying economic competition. In addition, the ESR speaks extensively about jobs and strengthening resilience, with Section B of the report specifically devoted to it. Thrust 6 makes a specific call to shorten the current requirement for companies to submit a mandatory retrenchment notification within 5 working days after workers are notified. My speech expands on this and will focus on worker resilience, the reality of how retrenchment hits our workers, and how we can better support them, because a resilient economy cannot be built on the backs of insecure workers. That is why I believe the time has come for Singapore to legislate minimum retrenchment benefits, a subject I have pursued previously in this House, most recently in April this year and separately in the context of the ongoing review of the Employment Act. In advocating for the legislation of retrenchment benefits, my speech will cover 4 broad sections. First, I will provide an overview of the retrenchment situation in Singapore. Second, I will summarize the legal position on retrenchment benefits in Singapore. Thirdly, I will explain why retrenchment benefits are important for workers. And fourthly, I will address the common reasons against the legislation of retrenchment benefits and how they should be reviewed in light of the ESR's broader recommendations. First, the local situation. Last Friday, the Straits Times, published an article titled, "Singapore Adds More Jobs in Q2, Even as Retrenchments Rose." Within the story, it was reported that the 4,500 retrenchments from April to June this year were the highest since the last quarter of 2020. Over the last 12 months, Lazada, Gardenia, Shopee, Asia Pacific Breweries, Agoda, DHL, and Yeo Hiap Seng are just some of the household names that have announced retrenchments, which made the headlines in Singapore, with some moving operations across the border to Malaysia. In 2024, the major technology companies in Singapore, such as Meta, TikTok, Dyson, Microsoft, and Google, collectively cut at least 9,000 jobs in Singapore. In this regard, 2 specific data points are noteworthy. Firstly, in 2024 and 2025, total employment in Singapore grew, and the unemployment rate has remained low at around 2% in 2024 and 2025. However, recorded retrenchments have increased in recent years from 6,440 in 2022 to 13,020 in 2024 and 14,490 in 2025. Secondly, from 2020 to 2025, 8 out of 10 eligible employees were paid retrenchment benefits at or above the prevailing tripartite guideline of 2 weeks' salary for every year of service. This bodes well for a baseline legislated minimum retrenchment benefit starting point for all workers. This data point provided by the Ministry of Manpower, however, does not specifically reveal how many workers received the unionized norm of 1 month's salary for every year of service, although I understand this is not uncommon in many collective agreements. Critically, though, what we can reasonably extrapolate from both these data points is that in 2024, for example, potentially close to 3,000 retrenched workers in Singapore either received no retrenchment benefits at all or received less than what is prescribed by the tripartite guidelines. That is not a small number by any stretch. Today, many economies in Asia provide some form of legislative statutory protection for retrenched workers. However, workers in Singapore have no statutory entitlement to retrenchment benefits. Outside contract, retrenchment benefits remain largely governed by tripartite norms and employer practices. To receive retrenchment benefits, workers in Singapore are dependent on the goodwill of employers, the terms of their employment contracts, or the strength of their bargaining position after they have already lost their jobs. This legislative omission in our employment laws sits in stark contrast to the reality our workers face as set out by the ESR report. First, that Singaporeans should not assume that economic growth will automatically result in the same extent of job creation as before. And secondly, that despite Singapore's positive employment situation, worker anxiety has increased across a wide range of sectors. I now move on to the second section of my speech on the legal position. Singapore's courts and tribunals have reaffirmed a legal position that does not sit easily with workers. In GIF versus JIG, the Employment Claims Tribunal held that Section 45 of the Employment Act does not create a statutory entitlement to retrenchment benefits. The tribunal held that retrenchment benefits are payable only when they arise from a contract of employment, collective agreement, or some other legal basis. Tripartite guidelines do not create such a legal basis. Indeed, this position can be traced back to the Court of Appeal's decision in Bethlehem Singapore Private Limited versus Le Hock Seng, which made it clear that Section 45 does not compel employers to pay retrenchment benefits simply because an employee has completed a qualifying period of service. The significance of the tribunal judgment in particular is magnified by its timing, and it forces us to confront an important policy question. At the very moment the ESR is asking Singaporeans to prepare for an era of more frequent restructuring, more rapid technological disruption, and greater economic uncertainty, the courts have reminded us that workers facing retrenchment possess no general statutory entitlement to retrenchment benefits. The question before Parliament is whether the law remains adequate for workers and the economy that the ESR hopes to evince. In my view, the law has fallen behind. Let us look around the region. China legislates economic compensation for workers affected by redundancy and restructuring. South Korea imposes significant legal requirements before redundancies may be carried out. Taiwan legislates severance entitlements. Malaysia legislates termination and layoff benefits. Thailand legislates severance payments based on years of service. Indonesia legislates retrenchment compensation. The Philippines legislates separations pay. These countries differ enormously in their political systems, labor markets, and stages of economic development. Yet, they have all reached a common conclusion. Business flexibility for employers and worker protection are not mutually exclusive. I now move on to my third section on why retrenchment benefits are crucial for our workers. Retrenchment benefits matter because they support workers and their families precisely at the stage of life when financial obligations can often be at their greatest. They represent an important layer of support provided by employers, complementing taxpayer-funded assistance such as job seeker support. In the Singapore context, this additional financial relief is especially important given how leveraged many households are. According to DBS Bank's 2025 installment of its Financial Wellness Series, which analyzed, aggregated, and anonymized data from approximately 2 million DBS and POSB retail customers, Gen Zs and millennials aged 25 to 44 are increasingly shouldering heavier liabilities and are falling behind their older counterparts in building retirement savings. Among pre-retirement age groups, those aged 35 to 44 are the most financially stretched, with debts slightly overweighing liquid assets, largely due to housing, vehicle, and credit card loans. Outside these age bands, when a worker in his 50s loses his or her job, the consequences extend far beyond immediate income loss. CPF contributions stop, retirement balances grow more slowly, housing obligations continue, healthcare expenses continue, caregiving responsibilities continue. Retrenchment is not merely a labor market issue for many. It is also a retirement adequacy issue, a housing issue, a family issue, and a social stability issue. As Singapore transits towards a high-wage, high-cost economy, the effects of retrenchment will become even more severe if workers are unable to secure employment at a comparable income level. The mental health dimension of job loss and financial security, financial insecurity, cannot be understated either. Taxpayers are playing their part financing the job seeker support scheme, and the government and labor movement are devoting significant resources towards retraining. Employers must play their part too. Based on the available data on retrenchment benefits, we know that many employers are already prepared to shoulder that responsibility and pay retrenchment benefits to workers. The fourth section of my speech will deal with the arguments against the legislation of retrenchment benefits. Throughout Singapore's history, many worker protections were initially criticized as threats to business competitiveness. When workfare was introduced, concerns were raised about costs, even as workfare was taxpayer funded. When the progressive wage model was expanded, concerns were raised about costs, especially after government wage support tapers off. When platform workers were granted stronger protections, concerns were again raised about costs. In fact, when the government announced the review of the Employment Act last year, the Singapore National Employers Federation cautioned that the review should not, and I quote, inadvertently mandate progressive employment practices that may reduce flexibilities for employers and undermine business competitiveness. Yet, advancing major pro-worker reforms are always important because economic growth alone is never enough. Today, we regard things like workfare as part of a mature and balanced economic system. Retrenchment benefits should be viewed in exactly the same way. Over the years, the Ministry of Manpower has advanced several arguments against legislating retrenchment benefits for our workers. However, the risks it has hitherto identified should be carefully examined and weighed afresh against the increasingly unpredictable economic landscape facing workers in the years ahead, as outlined by the ESR report. The first argument is that mandatory retrenchment benefits may make employers more hesitant to offer long-term or permanent employment contracts. Yet the existence of mandatory retrenchment benefits in many economies, including advanced economies, has not eliminated permanent employment. It is clear that such demands are influenced by a range of factors, including labor demand, skills and manpower shortages, productivity and broader labor market regulations. In the Singapore context, a generally tight labor market could have the opposite effect, with employers competing to hire the best with a permanent contract and important lure. Second, the government has argued that legislating a minimum retrenchment benefit may result in employers converging on that very minimum. However, the facts do not fully support this concern. There is already a tripartite guideline. There are already collective agreements that prescribe retrenchment benefits, and the vast majority of employers converge at those benchmarks anyway, with a very small number paying more than the 1-month norm for each year of service. It is therefore not obvious that legislation would necessarily result in a different status quo, with employers prevented from paying a higher amount should they deem it appropriate to do so. Finally, it has been argued that mandatory retrenchment benefits may affect the viability of companies already facing financial difficulties and could place remaining employees at greater risk. This concern must be weighed against the reality that financial difficulty does not automatically extinguish obligations of distressed firms, such as unpaid wages, CPF contributions, taxes, supplier debts, or bank loans. Businesses do also account for employee leave encashment, gratuity obligations, contractual liabilities, and debt repayments. Retrenchment benefits can be similarly treated as a foreseeable employment cost, as they are today by progressive employers. More importantly, this argument assumes that retrenchments only occur when companies are losing money. But that is not always the case. Many retrenchments occur when profitable firms restructure, automate functions, consolidate operations, relocate activities, or seek to improve profitability, as we have seen in Singapore over the last few years. In such circumstances, retrenchment is often a strategic business decision rather than a last resort. Indeed, this helps explain why some unions have successfully negotiated for enhanced retrenchment benefits in the absence of statutory protection, precisely because not all firms retrench workers due to financial distress. Like earlier efforts to strengthen worker protection, legislating retrenchment benefits will inevitably attract concerns from businesses. Those concerns deserve attention and respect because it is neither simple nor straightforward to start, build, or sustain a business. However, we should not forget that many responsible employers already provide retrenchment benefits. 8 out of 10 eligible employees already receive retrenchment benefits up to the tripartite guideline of 2 weeks' salary for every year of service. As I mentioned earlier, this can serve as the starting point for legislated retrenchment benefits. This would largely formalize an existing practice while ensuring that workers who fall through the gap that cannot be bridged by non-binding tripartite guidelines are protected. Responsible employers would no longer be disadvantaged relative to those who provide the bare minimum or nothing at all. A statutory framework could also be enhanced by subsidiary legislation directing higher payouts for larger firms, such as up to the union norm of 1 month's salary for every year of service, something which larger global MNCs in particular would not necessarily balk at, especially since they are already subject to legislative regimes governing retrenchment benefits in other countries where they operate. The ability of smaller employers to pay retrenchment benefits often comes up as a concern against legislating retrenchment benefits completely. The concerns of these small businesses are not irrelevant or unimportant. A business with a revenue of $500,000 is certainly a different enterprise compared to one that records $50 million in revenue. Various countries address this particular issue differently, even as they legislate for retrenchment benefits. Some create backstops, such as national insurance schemes, while others advance wage guarantee agreements, while yet others treat retrenchment benefits as a preferential debt through insolvency laws. These are not uncharted waters, and a perfect legislative retrenchment benefits regime does not need to be the enemy of a good regime that protects more workers than it does today in Singapore. In conclusion, the call for legislating retrenchment benefits is about what kind of society we want Singapore to become. The ESR calls on more international enterprises to set up regional headquarters in Singapore and is fundamentally an economic plan for the future. It sees international trust in the Singapore brand as a strategic asset that Singapore rightly seeks to leverage in advancing its economic value proposition. Yet, that trust hosts an important domestic dimension that builds that very Singapore brand. Trust and commitment to an employer is strengthened when workers know that after years of service, if restructuring occurs through no fault of their own, they will receive fair and meaningful protection. Therefore, as part of the government's implementation of the Economic Strategy Review, I urge the government to convene employers, unions, and workers to develop a statutory retrenchment benefits framework with the objective of introducing legislation. A resilient society requires workers who know they will not be left to bear the burdens of economic change alone. Because in line with the call of the labor movement and NTUC no less, while not every job can be protected, every worker deserves protection. I support the original motion in the names of MP Kenneth Tiong and Jamus Lim, which calls for an inclusive and equal economy for all Singaporeans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Post-independence, we were razor-focused on pursuing economic growth as a young nation, trying to stand on our own 2 feet, opening ourselves to foreign investment, connecting ourselves with networks of global trade, and providing fertile ground for businesses, both global and local, to flourish. This resulted in vast improvement of the quality of life for large swathes of our population, and for many, the promise of a better future for our next generation was a beacon of hope for which we work towards. Yet, in recent years, it is not unheard of for our residents to ask, should economic growth be our ultimate endgame? The latest Economic Strategy Review report provides us a valuable opportunity for reflection and to rethink what progress means to Singapore. But in a time when retrenchments dominate newspaper headlines, anxious residents worry about unstable livelihoods, and our little red dot feels the ever-rising heat from climate change, it is timely for us to think how we can put economic growth in service of broader societal progress. We need a Singapore economy that provides breathing room for each and every one of our people to be the best version of ourselves. A few years back, I spoke about Kate Raworth's concept of donut economics, which envisions an economy that places at its heart a collective well-being and equality to achieve a safe and just space for humanity, whilst protecting our Earth from further environmental destruction. This is more relevant than ever. Our economic policies must embody an ethos of equity and collective and planetary well-being, while providing opportunities for all in our society to thrive. I will address 3 key areas today towards this goal. First, tackling our care system. Second, providing the right ecosystem for creatives and entrepreneurs to thrive. Third, protecting our planet. If our economy is to be rooted in equity and collective well-being, we must first look at who determines how our economic pie is sliced. Of the members and 5 committees involved in the ESR, it appears to mainly comprise C-suite and NTUC union leaders. Even as we recognize their insights, organizations representing migrant workers, women's rights, and persons with disabilities should also have been more clearly represented. Our economic trajectory must be shaped by the people, with the people, and for the people. Diversity and perspective, representing the diverse stakeholders in our economy, must be used to identify potential blind spots and marginalized communities, and how these diverse communities live and experience our policies, economic and otherwise. When we talk about economic contribution, our economic structure often focuses on the elite worlds of finance, tech, and commerce. Yet, our economy is kept dynamic by a very diverse group of professionals whose contributions are invaluable for their collective economic success. In particular, our care economy, comprising both paid and unpaid labor in childcare, elder care, healthcare, and various social services. A foundational building block for any economy, our care infrastructure is what leads to the broader growth, well-being, and human development for current and future generations. Building our care infrastructure must be seen as a priority, not just an afterthought, a problem to fix due to demographic changes. In this line, Thrust 5 of the ESR recommended that we improve the attractiveness of AI-resilient sectors such as allied health, early childhood education, and social work. Many proposals were raised, such as job redesign, clarifying progression pathways, and strengthening skills, development, and certification. But also, it mentioned increased wage support. Granted, this is a tricky balance. An example can be seen in action by the UK's latest attempt to reform social care, which is envisaged to be a long and costly process involving difficult decisions, even as there is room for statements that carers need to be the best paid in society rather than the worst. Yet even in Singapore, wage support is sorely needed for our caregivers. Latest MOM data as of June 2025 indicates the median gross wage earned by registered nurses at $5,129 per month. Social workers earn $4,565. Preschool teachers earn $4,150. These numbers are lower than the overall median gross monthly income from employment of $5,775. Even as we acknowledge that wage support is overdue, care workers must also be better acknowledged and supported for their invaluable contribution towards our society, regardless of their ability to weather AI-induced disruptions. Wages in the care economy must commensurate with the rising cost of living. We also need to address the heavy emotional toll faced by care workers. A 2022 study published in the Singapore Academy of Medicine official journal, measuring burnout in the public healthcare sector between July 2019 and January 2020, found that 37.8% of respondents have high emotional exhaustion scores, 29.7% have high depersonalization scores, and 55.3% had low personal accomplishment scores. Another study conducted in the second half of 2024 in our National University polyclinics also found that nearly 10% of participants stated that they intended to leave their current position in the next 6 months. The authors of the study found this concerning, noting that the resignation rate of healthcare workers during the COVID pandemic was just 4%. Just as the Law Society recently started to review the prevailing work culture for lawyers, it is time for our regulatory bodies to work with industry and NGOs in care economy segments to officially track workplace well-being and examine prevailing workplace standards. Support for local entrepreneurship in the care economy is also key. The care economy is highly labor-intensive, and our general grants supporting capital needs in entrepreneurship and capability building need closer scrutiny. While the current existence of the Venture for Good grant administered by RAISE supports early and growth stage social enterprises for up to $300,000 in capital expenditure and operating costs, how can we support more startups and commercial enterprises in this space to bring sustainable investments into the care economy? RAISE SG must work with MTI and MSF jointly to review the care economy investment ecosystem to build a more sustainable investments and employment ecosystem. Caregiving is also borne by informal carers, such as family and friends. This labor of love is not reflected in GDP figures, but its importance is underscored by the inaugural Duke NUS study, which valued the economic contribution of informal caregiving for seniors at $1.28 billion annually. The efforts of our caregivers often come at a cost, sacrificing health, careers, and leisure time to care for loved ones. It is also why I have been calling since 2020 for official, regular time use studies for us to better understand our carers' needs and to measure the hidden economic and personal costs behind care. Carers also need better support, which is why our party's manifesto has called for, amongst others, compensation for family caregivers and the expansion of respite care. Singapore must bridge the gap of seeing care beyond being a cost. We must see caregiving as a growth segment that builds not just the economy of today, but the society of tomorrow. Our society of tomorrow must also support creatives and entrepreneurs who dare to dream and pursue their own passions. How do we ensure that our local entrepreneurs and dreamers can have their passion made possible in Singapore? To create the conditions for entrepreneurship to grow, we must first, as a society, foster a culture of self-discovery and exploration from young. Expanding entrepreneurship-related programs in schools and encouraging critical thinking and empathy, as prescribed in the ESR report, only goes so far if our system does not reward risk-taking or having room to make mistakes and learn. How do we explain the gap between the decades-long efforts to build an education system to be more holistic against the reality that these additional layers simply create new pathways for education arms races? What do we need to do to address parents or would-be parents' fears for the next generation in an age of million-dollar HDB resale prices, ever-soaring COE prices, and the never-ending sense of scarcity? While this is a whole nother topic, it is relevant to our economic policies for the future. For today, I would like to instead focus on our creatives and entrepreneurs. Our creatives are risk-takers and visionaries. They turn ideas into commercial and cultural value and inspire the wonder that a thriving society needs. Yet, a career in the arts remains a difficult choice in Singapore. Regulatory hurdles have forced artists to alter or remove public artworks, while beloved art spaces have shuttered under rising costs and redevelopment pressures. These are not small setbacks. They chill the very activity we say we want to nurture. The one-off culture pass is only a first step. What our creatives need is sustained support, dedicated work, display, and commercial spaces to hone their craft and earn a decent living, backed by sensible commercial space regulations. These should sit alongside spaces for budding entrepreneurs, much like the creative and cultural parks we see in cities such as Beijing and Taipei, proof that culture and commerce can thrive side by side. Next, supporting the growth ambitions of our businesses, large and small. Small home-based businesses can be a testbed for aspiring founders to launch businesses. But the next step is often daunting, with commercial overheads quickly becoming prohibitive. Can the government across agencies provide more affordable short-term stalls and shop spaces across HDB, URA, and JTC managed properties for first-time entrepreneurs, taking inspiration from the now ubiquitous shared office facilities to offer smaller modular units with lower renovation and deposit requirements, and allow tenancy periods that are shorter or easier contractual conditions for potential exit? For SMEs looking to scale, the ESR report acknowledges that companies still find it difficult to secure growth stage capital and that Temasek already participates in SME co-investment. But what our businesses need to grow is bolder and broader based access to financing, catalyzed by private and public capital. ESG co-invested companies through the Startup SG Equity Scheme should be required to list on either the SGX mainboard or Catalyst. And ESG should work with SGX on governance and disclosure requirements for co-invested companies to ease the path to listing. Together with the Equity Market Development Program, this can improve liquidity in our domestic equity market and attract more liquidity into these companies. Such companies should also be explicitly tracked on the impact they have beyond returns, for example, their contribution to activity and employment in Singapore. This is similar in spirit to Ireland's Strategic Investment Fund, which has a double bottom line mandate. To further encourage would-be entrepreneurs, we also need an ecosystem with structural measures to promote necessary risk-taking for success. After I spoke in early May this year about supporting entrepreneurship amongst youth, including a call to adapt our current bankruptcy framework, a Straits Times article on 26th May indicated that business failure is among the top reasons why individuals go into personal bankruptcy. Yet working out of bankruptcy is often difficult, with practical limits on day-to-day activities and no automatic discharge. This can hold back those with bold ideas from taking the plunge. Pro-data reforms have been found to be linked to better entrepreneurship and innovation outcomes. An EU expert group report in 2011 suggests that, quote, a second chance policy that enables formerly bankrupt entrepreneurs restart may represent one of the most promising and underexploited policy options for company creation and job growth. The EU has since adopted a more balanced, preventive restructuring approach for bona fide entrepreneurs seeking a second chance. I will thus repeat our call to see if our bankruptcy regime can be reformed to encourage more would-be entrepreneurs to step up. Finally, thriving humans need a flourishing planet. Yet, the relentless pursuit of economic growth on this planet has resulted in the over-extraction of precious natural resources, damage to ecosystems, and disruption to communities. Thrust 8 of the ESR recommended that businesses prepare for a low-carbon and climate-resilient future. Noticeably, a heavy emphasis was placed on preparing businesses to shield themselves from the harmful effects of climate change, while not acknowledging that historically it has been corporations and industrial development that have been the very reason we are now experiencing planetary distress. We need more attention and details on how our policies will make our enterprises and economies to be part of the solution to climate change, particularly in view of thrust 2 of the ESR involves making Singapore a global leader for AI. As I said during the debate on Singapore's use of AI, there's undoubtedly potential to harness the power of AI for greater economic and societal good. Yet we at the same time hear about how low-wage workers in developing nations are forced to view explicit content to train AI, as well as concerns about adverse effect on cognitive development and critical thinking. More expressly, data centers, driven by AI-induced demand, guzzle up large amounts of energy and water, increasing carbon emissions, driving up utility prices, and disrupting the lives of nearby communities. The earlier 2019 moratorium on new data centers, as well as higher operating costs here, drove operators to set up shop in neighboring Johor and Batam, with Singaporean companies owning the largest proportion of data center capacity in both regions. This has caused disamenities for local communities, even prompting a group of Johor residents to protest against the construction of a nearby data center. Moving data centers further away also does not solve the problem. During my trip to Thailand in June, I noticed that while policymakers were excited about investment and growth opportunities for AI in partnership with countries like Singapore, there were also concerns about the environmental and sustainability impact of such investments. While the planned resumption of data center construction in Singapore requires the use of greener energy sources, how exactly are we balancing the needs for our precious land? Does this result in land that could otherwise be maintained to be for nature and green spaces to be ultimately razed down to meet industrial and housing requirements? Such green spaces are key to bolstering our heat resilience and are rapidly disappearing in the name of growth and economic survival. Concern is mounting over forests being cut down for housing, both at Maju Forest and Gilman Barracks, alongside a patch of forest near Woodlands Checkpoint, which would be cleared for the development of a new commercial hub. while over 52 hectares of forested land will be cut down for the next phase of the Jurong Innovation District. Intensifying business and industrial operations ultimately affects our energy consumption. The EMA noted that electricity consumption increased by 4% year-on-year in 2024, with commerce and service-related businesses consuming the highest proportion that year at 40.2% of our total electricity use. The situation is worse for water, particularly with data centers being huge consumers. Already, non-domestic water consumption takes up 55% of our total water use, and PUB estimates that this is expected to increase to 60% by 2065. What are we doing to mitigate this impact? And even before we craft our policies to address the impact on the climate, we must first measure the environmental impact. As I first mentioned during my budget speech in 2022, a critical first step will be to track and monitor our policies' environmental outcomes via an environmental dashboard. This could be aided by the recent introduction of the Singapore Classification for Environmental Purposes, which is used to classify data relating to environmental activities and products. We would do well to remember that Mother Earth is not humankind's personal ATM. We must ensure that our economic policies should not result in further destruction of our planet, and a transparent accounting of its environmental outcomes would be a helpful tool to keep us on our toes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, progress towards tomorrow does not mean that we compromise on our collective well-being for the sake of GDP growth. Progress means that we, as a society, support balanced and well-rounded lifestyles, weave strong safety nets for our people, recognize all who contribute meaningfully to society, provide opportunities for everyone to dream big, and uphold our responsibility as stewards of Mother Earth. The society of tomorrow that is built in Singapore must be one where all of us will thrive and enjoy the fruits of our effort together. And I believe that we can achieve that and so much more for us and the generations that come.
Last July, the Prime Minister noted that ASEAN's per capita GDP today is around $6,000, and that if it reaches $10,000 or more, it is, in his words, a complete game changer. A young region, a rising middle class on our doorstep. His observation is not new. The latest Economic Strategy Review report identifies Southeast Asia as an engine of growth. The Emerging Stronger Task Force in 2021, under its Stronger Together pillar, had called for the deepening of partnerships, especially with Southeast Asia. So did the Committee on the Future Economy in 2017, in the first of 7 strategies. Every major economic blueprint of the past decade has named the region as key to Singapore's future. So the question is not whether Southeast Asia matters. We have consensus that it does. But what have we actually done about it? This motion believes that an economy of the future that works for all includes an economic engine driven by Singaporeans and Singaporean capital venturing abroad. Now, the ESR is explicit about the latter, and several members of the House has echoed this. The report asks that more of our own companies start, scale, and succeed globally. It seeks deeper trade and supply chain links across the region, and it envisions a Singapore where capital is raised, structured, deployed, and recycled across the region and the world. Around each sits a familiar architecture of support, grants and market entry support for our companies, while our public institutions co-invest, de-risk, and finance their expansion, which draws private Singaporean capital out alongside them. The Workers' Party supports all of this. But capital does not manage itself in a market it does not know. Someone has to be there to turn capital that has been deployed into capital that is productive. The more successful we are at sending capital and our companies into the region, the more pressing the question that ESR does not answer. Who are we sending with it? 2 weekends ago, the government unveiled the new SG Youth Plan, a separate blueprint for young Singaporeans, just a month after the ESR report, guided by the same conviction that our future lies in the region. It picks up on this thread that the ESR left hanging. It puts young Singaporeans and regional exposure at its center and comes with some numbers. It commits to expanding overseas exposure for young Singaporeans, 17,000 short-term exposure places a year by 2030, up from the current 9,000, 3,000 overseas internships in ASEAN, China, and India, double from today's 1,500. It expands on what young Singaporeans say we want. 63% agree that regional work experience would help us advance faster, and half of us are willing to take up internships or jobs elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is encouraging. The appetite is there. If half of us are already willing to go, then what we should be looking at is whether the state invests in building us something worth going to and something worth coming back to. And on this note, I want to highlight 3 gaps. The first is offtake. The SG Youth Plan outlines a game plan focused on supply. More trips, more internships, earlier access. Every one of its regional commitments is about sending young Singaporeans out. But what happens when we come home is the most decisive. Because if we return to a job market and promotion board that treats 6 months in Jakarta as a detour rather than an asset, then only one obvious conclusion will be drawn, that such experiences are a penalty rather than a premium. Do enough employers in Singapore value and reward regional experience? While I cannot speak for all employers, I would like to share a perspective from our largest employer, the government. In April, I filed a parliamentary question asking where government scholars have studied in the past decade. The answer I received was, and I quote, "Taking into account all government scholarships, including PSC, over the last 3 years, from 2023 to 2025, on an annual average basis, 49% of the recipients studied at local autonomous universities, 30% in the UK, 15% in the US, and 6% in other countries. 6% for the entire rest of the world, the whole of ASEAN included. I also asked if there were minimum targets for scholars to study in non-English speaking countries and/or regions. The answer was no. Now, I'm not doubting the quality of an Oxford, Cambridge, or an Ivy League education. But these numbers mean that when we select and invest in young Singaporeans who will return to serve in the public service, a small group of whom might even take public office in the future, 10 out of 20 of them stay home, while another 9 go west. If the government is not prioritizing and encouraging region readiness in the public service, how can we ask young Singaporeans to believe that there is market demand for this? The second gap is depth. Exposure does not equal fluency or capability. 17,000 young Singaporeans spending some time in the region is not 17,000 region-ready Singaporeans. The SG Youth Plan included the story of an ITE student who came home after being sent to Hanoi. She was more confident and eager to explore opportunities beyond our shores. But inspiration is only a beginning. It is not an outcome. Real region readiness is built over years, not weeks. The language learned, the workings of the market understood from the inside, the network that answers when you call. Have we invested sufficiently in structures that will deepen this? Key third languages offered to our students remain French, German, Japanese, and Spanish, when blueprint after blueprint emphasize that our future lies with neighbors whose languages we do not teach. If we are serious, is it not time to ask whether Thai and Vietnamese also belong on that list? A short trip creates a memory. Language and cultural understanding are often the difference between a visitor and a partner. The third, and perhaps most important gap, is whether and how any of this will be measured. Because we heard this aspiration before, especially in 2018 during our term as ASEAN Chair. It was, appropriately, a year of speeches about how the region was our future and how the government will help Singaporeans seize it. In September 2018, in a written reply to a question on our progress in going regional, then Minister for Trade and Industry, Chan Chun Sing, set out what we were doing for talent. We had the Youth Talent Program, which targeted sending 1,000 students each year for work opportunities in overseas markets. We had a professional conversion program for Southeast Asia ready talent to reskill professionals for roles in the region. We also had an ASEAN leadership program to help senior business leaders understand and grow into Southeast Asian markets. And what became of them? It appears that the first two, in one form or another, are still with us. The Youth Talent Program was folded into the Global Ready Talent Program, which we were told supported 29,470 students between 2020 and 2024. The Professional Conversion Program was renamed and runs today as the Career Conversion Program for Internationalization Professionals. But what is less clear is what outcomes they have achieved 8 years on. The 29,470 figure for the Global Ready Talent Program includes both domestic and overseas placements. It is only starting this April that local internship support has been discontinued. So how many actually went abroad? And of those who did, where did they go? how many of them went on to work in the region or in a region-facing role? For the career conversion program, how many professionals converted? From what sectors and into what roles? Has it helped their career trajectory? What about the ASEAN Leadership Program? How many leaders went through it? What became of their company's regional ambitions? Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have looked and struggled to find answers to the above questions from the public record. We have been generous in announcing schemes to build region-ready Singaporeans, but seemingly less willing to measure whether they worked. If yes, what worked well? If not, what fell short of expectations? Some figures that I do have are from the ESR report. While 50% of Singaporeans express interest in working abroad, only 3% have actually done a stint of 6 months or more. So with the new SG Youth Plan aspiring to 17,000 regional immersion opportunities for young Singaporeans, I would like to ask, what has changed this time so that in 2030 we will be able to say whether it worked? How will the government track not just how many places were filled, but how many young people go on to work in region-facing roles or to build a career or business in the region? Because if not, we are simply announcing a larger number to not measure. And as we chair ASEAN again in 2027, I hope we will not only articulate our ambition to plug into the region, but actively track and report on our investments in resourcing this ambition. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to now highlight a scheme, the Overseas Market Immersion Program, the OMIP, that best captures how our ambition and strategy diverge. The OMIP aims to give young Singaporeans real regional work experience, not just a taste of it. It works by helping employers send younger Singaporeans on structured postings abroad. It was launched in 2024 with the goal of 250 places over 2 years, significantly lower than the 2018 target of 1,000 a year. To date, it has supported more than 180 professionals. Now, the SG Youth Plan will expand the OMIP, not by scaling it so there are more places, but by widening the eligibility by dropping the 2-year rule so that younger professionals may qualify. This means more will be eligible without a commitment to send more people. Widening the gate is not the same as sending more people through it. Eligibility without capacity is an invitation without a seat. On behalf of fellow young Singaporeans, I have 2 asks. 1, complement the eligibility widening by scaling the number of available places. And 2, delink it from employers. An employer-led scheme means a young Singaporean can only go if a company chooses to send them. It is dependent on the company having the HR capacity to manage an overseas posting. Rather than run a people scheme through companies, let us focus it on the people instead. Fund the OMIP directly as a fixed-term stint, at fair wages, open to all graduates from our tertiary institutions. Let's select based on our graduates' drive, curiosity, and seriousness, rather than our company's ability to shoulder the administrative burden of overseas postings. We would not be the first to do this. France's Volontariat International Entreprise, the International Corporate Volunteer Program, also known as the VIE, proves that it is possible to do more, and even shows us how. The VIE places more than 11,500 young people abroad every year. They can directly search and apply for open positions that range from 6 to 24 months on the VIE platform. When selected, these young people sign a contract with Business France, a state agency, instead of the host company. Business France looks after payroll, health coverage, and social protection. The host company picks the candidate, supervises their work, and pays the allowance to Business France. The state sits in the middle and absorbs the friction that neither an individual nor a small company can carry alone. It works, and the French government has the numbers to prove it, because they measured it. 9 in 10 young persons on a VIE assignment find a job within 6 months of completing their stint. More than 7 in 10 come back fluent in the language where they've been posted. It is a scheme that produces more than inspiration. It kickstarts careers and builds capabilities. And tellingly, Singapore is among its top 10 destinations. We are on the receiving end of another country's talent pipeline, but are struggling to build our own. Now, I am not saying that we copy the French VIE program wholesale, but we should draw inspiration from its design. Explore how the state can offer support for what individuals and small companies cannot do on their own. And we should measure the outcomes of our programs, like France does for the VIE. Publish not just how many places were filled, but how many are in a role with explicit regional mandate or impact 2 and 5 years after completing the OMIP stint. Let us fund the appetite that young Singaporeans have and measure outcomes rather than output. And finally, we should go beyond the scheme and consider how we can tear down the wall that young Singaporeans find ourselves up against. The SG Youth Plan will see the launch of a new program called Adulting 101. It will teach us about CPF, public housing policy, marriage and parenthood. It correctly identifies the very things that weigh on a young person deciding whether to take an overseas work opportunity. But these are not just facts to be explained. They are structures that will need to change for those who aspire to be regionally mobile. A young Singaporean weighing 3 years in Bangkok or Ho Chi Minh is not only weighing salary against salary. She is weighing it against a BTO queue that rewards those who stay home, against CPF contributions a regional employer will not make, against the challenges of coming home to a housing and healthcare system she stepped out of. We have built a domestic architecture so finely tuned for staying home that leaving often means accepting penalties. During his IPS lectures last year, Mr. Philip Yeo acknowledged this wall. His account of his EDB years was blunt. Send officers out while they are young and single, because by their mid-30s, with children and a mortgage, it becomes too hard. So developing region-ready Singaporeans means we should also consider how we can better support those who choose to go out. Explore how we can ensure that a regional posting does not complicate BTO opportunity and obligations, that children who go on post with their parents can have a seamless re-entry into school in Singapore. These cost only a fraction of the benefit they could bring and could go a long way to quell a family's hesitation. Now let me close by drawing these threads together. The ESR speaks of creating good jobs, and the SG Youth Plan echoes it with the moves to help Singaporeans land them. But for too long, we have pictured the good job as a high-value role inside an MNC that chose to base itself here in Singapore. It is a good job that depends on someone else's decision to come. There is another kind of good job, one we seize because a field is taking shape around us and Singapore is well placed to lead it. The growing social impact sector in Southeast Asia. And here I declare my interest as a professional in the social impact space. As the public and private sectors in the region turn towards impact to close gaps in issues ranging from health and education to financial inclusion and climate resilience, someone has to convene players, develop benchmarks, innovate for solutions. These are building blocks of a new pool of good jobs that a small country like Singapore can punch above our weight in. But it is also the kind of ambition that goes unrealized if we do not build a pipeline to seize it. For years, our answer to the regional talent gap has been to draw in the region's brightest, educate them here, and hope they stay. That worked well when we were the obvious best choice. But our region is catching up, and this advantage shrinks each year as our neighbours close the gap. As my fellow member Edward Chia said earlier, we must attract the best from the world while developing the best in Singaporeans. The talent we import appreciates for a while, then goes home. The Singaporean we equip to work in the region appreciates for a lifetime. A region-ready Singaporean holds capability that is hers, portable, not contingent on a company's decision to base itself here. We have been slow to build the bridge that carries our people out and quicker to build a wall that keeps them home. So next year, when we assume the chairmanship of ASEAN, it will, once again, and appropriately so, be a year of speeches about how the region is our future and how the government will help Singaporeans seize it. I hope that this time around, we will not only name the potential of the region, as we did in 2018, but also help more Singaporeans seize it. I rise in support of the original motion tabled by my colleagues Kenneth Tiong and Associate Professor Jamus Lim.